Chapter 181. The Crown Prince tilted his head and dodged his mother's slap. He turned his hand to grab her cold wrist and looked at his mother quietly. The Empress had not expected the usually timid Crown Prince to have such a sharp gaze. Her body trembled, and she pulled her hand away from her son's. "Do you really think I did something wrong?" she asked slowly. The Crown Prince frowned and said softly, "I dare not." The Empress suddenly raised her voice. "Did you not know that Fan Xian and the second prince met on the pleasure boat?" The Crown Prince suddenly raised his head and looked straight into the Empress's eyes. "Mother, can you let me handle these things myself? Fan Xian is a great poet, and it is normal for him to meet with a second brother." The Empress was anxious and angry, but she did not know how to speak to her timid and fierce son. The Crown Prince looked at her and said quietly, "Mother, I have often thought that you should not be so sensitive. You will only drive away the officials who can help me to my other brothers." The Empress gritted her teeth. "I am the mother of the country. If I punish a minor official, would he dare to hold a grudge?" The Crown Prince mockingly said, "Mother, you should not have allowed Minister Han to act that day. You could not have actually killed Fan Xian, so why offend the Fan family and the Prime Minister? I think that after a few more days, Minister Han will not be able to hold his own in the court. There are not many officials in the court who are willing to be close to the Eastern Palace, and yet you insisted on cutting off a finger. I really do not know what you were thinking." The Empress frowned. Han Jiwei is the current minister of the court, and he was investigating the case according to the law. What could the Prime Minister and Fan Jian do? With the Eastern Palace protecting him, I think His Majesty will have to give you some face. Do not forget, Fan Xian is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and father has always admired him. The Crown Prince sighed and shook his head. Han Jiwei has offended too many powerful people this time. You must know that it was father who wanted to clean up the exam grounds. I cannot protect him. The Empress laughed coldly. Do not forget that Fan Xian has also offended many officials in the capital. Furthermore, the Imperial Censorate is involved. Although your aunt is far away in Xinjiang, with her influence in the court, I am sure she will not stand idly by. Don't mention my aunt. The Crown Prince seemed to loathe the eldest princess. She's been too strange these past 2 years. She's actually colluding with Northern Qi. She's too daring. Where does she put the face of the Qing kingdom? As for that Imperial Censor Gua of the Imperial Censorate, he was just a pretty boy she used to play with. Even if he was assassinated by the Overwatch Council, she wouldn't bat an eye. After all, the Crown Prince was the heir to the throne of a country. Although the eldest princess had always been close to the Eastern Palace, after Fan Xian's words fell like snowflakes across Jingdo, the Crown Prince was also a bit afraid of the eldest princess. Of course, there were other reasons. The Empress said painfully, "We have no other help except the eldest princess. I will rely on Imperial Father." The Crown Prince replied calmly. At this moment, the Crown Prince, who had always seemed rather cowardly, finally displayed the innate political sense and judgment of a member of the royal family. The Empress slowly closed her eyes and said, "In short, I don't like Fan Xian. Think of a way to kill him." Crown Prince slammed the table angrily and said, "Dai, have you forgotten that Fan Xian is Qianer's husband? You mustn't listen to my aunt all the time. That woman is mad. Mad, do you know that? Do you also want to become mad and be chased out of the royal palace?" The Empress was so angry that her entire body trembled. Pointing at the Crown Prince's nose, she said in a trembling voice, "What do you know? What do you know? What do you know? What do you know?" Perhaps the Crown Prince's words had touched the Empress's old wounds. In her anger, she said, "What do you know?" for times in a row. The eunuchs and serving girls had long hidden far away. In the Eastern Palace, there were only the mother and son. After a very long silence, the Empress stood. However, her body seemed a bit weak and swayed. The Crown Prince quickly rose to support her and helplessly asked for forgiveness. The Empress looked at her son with incomparable misery. There were already wrinkles at the sides of her beautiful almond-shaped eyes. Faintly, she said, "Throughout the dynasties and dynasties, the Crown Prince has always been the most difficult position to sit in. You have to guard your front and back. There is no one at home. You probably don't have many memories of the turmoil 12 years ago, but I remember clearly that if you don't fight for it, then what belongs to you will be taken away by others. The Crown Prince did his best to soften his voice and said quietly, I understand. Mother, go back to the palace to rest. The Empress shook her head. You don't understand these days. I've always had a bad feeling. This feeling is very strong, just like many years ago, when that woman entered Jingdo. Which woman? The Crown Prince asked curiously. At that moment, the heavy wooden door of the Eastern Palace was suddenly pushed open. Who is it? The Crown Prince furrowed his brows and angrily rebuked. An old eunuch walked in with a bent body and said respectfully, I, Hong Xiang, have come on the Empress Dowager's orders to invite the Empress to Hongguang Palace for a chat. A glimmer of fear flashed across the Empress's face. Shortly after, she piled a smile on her face. With a dignified bearing and the serving girl's support, she followed the bent eunuch Hong toward the true mistress of the royal palace. The Crown Prince furrowed his brows slightly. Although he disliked the old dog's rudeness, he knew he was the eunuch closest to his grandmother. Even his mother didn't want to offend him. Naturally, he wouldn't do anything more. The candlelight in the palace gradually dimmed. Crown Prince Li Chengqian thought of the absurd farce that day in the Ministry of Justice and felt even more depressed. He truly didn't understand why his mother listened to the eldest princess's words. Thinking of that young and charming aunt, the Crown Prince's heart warmed. His face was ashamed and slightly terrified. However, his eyes gradually revealed lust. He flicked his sleeves and walked toward the back of the hall. A moment later, there was a burst of almost inaudible moaning. A palace maid was tossing and turning under his body, begging for pleasure. The Crown Prince had completely lifted the woman's palace gown to her neck and face, covering her face, only revealing her white and full chest. As he forcefully penetrated, he panted heavily. He thought to himself, why are all the gentle and charming women in the world unwilling to lie obediently in bed and insist on showing off their stupid methods? Spring had come, the flowers were in bloom, and the birds were chirping. Yang Wanli and the other 3 newly promoted officials went to Fan Manor again, wanting to bathe in the spring breeze of Sir Fan Jr. Unexpectedly, Sir Fan Jr. was still not in the manor. What gave Ho Jicheng even more of a headache was that he had received news that Sir Fan Jr. was currently on a mission and would be leaving for Northern Qi the next day. The second-ranked Jinshi did not enter the Hanlin Academy. According to the rules of previous years, they would be sent to any local official. Seeing that the Ministry of Appointments was about to send them off, other than Shi Chanli, the other 3 naturally wanted to hear Fan Xian's opinion. After all, in this spring examination, the 3 of them had relied on Fan Xian's strength to get to this step. They naturally thought that Fan Xian would need them to do something locally. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not meet with them. He only left them 2 letters. One was for the 3 new officials who were about to leave the capital, and the other was for Shi Chanli, who was preparing to return to his hometown for the examination. The 4 of them sat in Fan Manor's study and took a sip of the good tea the servants had brought. Without caring to avoid arousing suspicion, they opened the 2 letters their teacher had left them. One of the letters was for Ho Jicheng and the other 2 scholars. It was a blank piece of paper with only 2 simple sentences written on it. Be a good person, be a good official. The last sentence was for Ho Jicheng. In the letter, Fan Xian wrote, Jicheng, do not be too henpecked. This was a cold joke that only Fan Xian understood. The 3 scholars naturally did not understand what it meant. They only focused on the first 2 sentences. Be a good person, be a good official. The more they thought about it, the more they felt that these simple words contained a very real truth. To learn to be an official, one had to first learn to be a good person. But there was another layer of meaning to these words, and they didn't know which one of them understood it. To be a good person was not to be a good person. To be a good official was not necessarily to be a good official. After reading this letter, Yang Wanli was naturally very interested in the letter in Shi Chanli's hands. He didn't know what was written in the letter that Sir Fan Jr. left for Shi Chanli. After all, among the four of them, only Sir Chanli seemed to have a dim future. Sir Chanli uneasily opened the letter under the gazes of his three friends. After a closer look, he saw that it was a few broken sentences, and he almost laughed out loud. Old Governor Fong is not cooperative. 30% man, 70% heaven. Do not worry that you have no friends under your umbrella. Play well and be idle. The last three words were idle, which meant that they were waiting for Fan Xian's return. Fan Xian was sitting in the courtyard he had originally bought, frowning slightly. His fingers stroked the hollow belt and felt the pill that Fei Jie had given him when he was young. At the time, his teacher had said that if anything happened to the tyrannical Jinqi in his body, he would have to rely on this pill to save his life. But after entering the capital, the tyrannical Jinqi in his body had always been very obedient, and he had somewhat forgotten about this matter. Today, when he was tidying up his equipment, he remembered. But after so many years, he didn't know if Fei Jie's pill had lost its effect. Wang Qinian sat across from him and respectfully replied, "I have found the person." He hesitantly raised his head and said, "Of course, there is a bit of a resemblance. Sir Commissioner is skilled in the art of disguise. With a bit of embellishment, presumably, a normal person looking from a distance would not be able to see any flaws. But there is still something wrong." "What's wrong?" Fan Xian was slightly startled. "Didn't you say it was quite similar?" "It's been a month, and the skin color is similar." Wang Qinian quietly replied, "To find someone as handsome as you among these dirty men is already a difficult task. Even if the appearance is similar, to impersonate the commissioner's naturally romantic temperament and scholarly elegance is a very difficult task." Fan Xian was startled and immediately understood. He jokingly scolded, "You're a supporting character. Nowadays, your flattery is becoming more and more unrestrained and wonderful." Chapter 182. That night, he returned to the manor and learned that Yang Wanli and the others had come. Fan Xian did not think much of it. In any case, he had already said what he wanted to say in the inn. As long as they were good officials, loved the people, and rose higher and higher official positions, it would be fine. Although Fan Xian was not a great hero who worked for the country and the people, he would be happy if a few of his students came up. As for the dirty things he might arrange for them to do in the future, he would think about it in the future. When he was about to leave, he couldn't help but hold hands with Ruoruo and look at her sister. He was speechless and choked. He carefully warned Xijia about the problem of earning money, bowed to his father, and saluted Lady Lu. Only then did he return to his bedroom. He was about to take off his clothes and go to bed to comfort his poor little wife when he found his brother-in-law, the silly Dabao, was in the room. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said a few words to Dabao. Lin Wanner watched from the side and felt it was strange. The relationship between her husband and her brother was truly strange. She didn't know how the two of them had so much to talk about, and she didn't know why Fan Xian was so patient. After a long time, Fan Xian and Dabao giggled and placed their right hands on each other's shoulders. They shouted something like a slogan before allowing the servants to lead Dabao out. "What are you talking about with Dabao?" Lin Wanner pitifully hugged the thin blanket and looked at him. She pouted as if she was jealous of her brother. Her bare feet were exposed outside the edge of the blanket. Her snow-white feet were exceptionally beautiful under the yellow blanket. Fan Xian smiled slightly and sat on the side of the bed. He stretched out his hand and gently stroked his wife's feet. His fingers playfully tickled the soles of her feet. He replied, he promised little Xian Xian that if little Xian Xian doesn't stay in the capital to play with him, he will be good. Lin Wanner felt the soles of her feet go numb. Hearing this flirtatious double entendre, her snow-white face suddenly reddened. Even the tips of her ears were a bit red. She looked very cute. She quickly pulled back her feet and said shyly, "It's still early." Fan Xian teased, Not early, not early. We leave tomorrow. We have to do it as soon as possible." "Right, did father have you go during the day?" Lin Wanner bumped into her husband, who was gentle and refined in front of others, but shameless and lewd in private. She really didn't know what to do, so she could only play a diversion. But she had played this trick too many times, and Fan Xian had long become immune to it. Father-in-law scolded me. First he scolded me about the exam, and then he scolded me about the mission to Northern Qi. I refused to listen to my father and his arrangements. In fact, when he entered the Prime Minister's manor that day, Fan Xian could clearly see his father-in-law's concern, but he didn't know where the old Prime Minister's concern came from. As he replied, his hands dishonestly moved up his wife's bare feet. In a moment, he went through the quilt, pulled out his 5 fingers, and grabbed her soft feet. Wanner let out a cry of surprise. As the husband and wife talked at night, they couldn't help but recall the situation in the Temple of Qing. Just as the sweetness was like a date, Fan Xian's heart thumped. He thought of Ku He, the great grandmaster of Northern Qi. He thought of the illusory temple. For some reason, his heart gradually grew heavy. Feeling his strangeness, Linwana propped herself up and lazily rested her head on his chest. She smiled and said, "You are leaving tomorrow. What are you thinking about?" Feeling his wife's hair slide across his bare chest, he felt a slight itch. Fan Xian smiled and chased all those useless things out of his mind. His shifty eyes rolled around. His gaze passed through his wife's black hair and the color of the night and landed greedily on Wanner's mostly exposed chest. Wanner looked into his eyes and felt that her husband's clear eyes seemed to speak. His gentle gaze was purer than most girls'. One moment it seemed to say that he was thinking of her, and the next moment it seemed to say that he couldn't bear to leave, and the next moment it seemed to say that he would come back soon. Wait, why did it seem like he was saying something very vulgar? She followed Fan Xian's gaze and found that her undergarments had long since slipped down to her waist. Her upper body was completely bare. She was extremely embarrassed, and with a soft cry, she quickly burrowed into the thin quilt. There was nothing else to look at. Fan Xian was angry at Wang Dong. He pretended to be angry and said, "You are an old married couple. Why are you still hiding?" Half of Lin Wanner's face peeked out from the thin quilt. She looked at her husband timidly, but there was a bashful smile in her watery eyes. Her covered lips whispered something. Fan Xian didn't understand. Lin Wanner's bare, white feet kicked lightly on the bed. She poked her face out of the thin blanket again, revealing her soft, tender lips. A lock of black hair fell on the side of her lips. She said shyly, "Didn't you say in the past to maintain that sense of mystery?" Fan Xian had long since been stunned by this sexy scene. How could he still maintain a sense of mystery at this time? Only a ghost would have a sense of mystery. He lifted the blanket, pulled his wife's soft body into his arms, and went with her to Mount Wu to view the scenery. After a long time, when the wind and rain had stopped and everyone was tired, Linwana opened her lake-like eyes and said sleepily, "We have to come back soon." Fan Xian half closed his eyes. There was a trace of a satisfied smile at the corners of his lips. His fingers tangled with his wife's hair. In a quiet voice, he said, "Don't worry, my luck in this life has been off the charts. Everything has been smooth sailing, and nothing has happened." The next day, outside the Overwatch Council prison, the head of the prison that Fan Xian had seen once before, one of the former heads of the Overwatch Council, stood expressionlessly outside the iron gate. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the former head of the 7th Bureau. He was shocked to find that there was a trace of unease in his eyes. The surroundings had long been filled with Overwatch Council spies and swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. A few carriages were parked outside the gate. Fan Xian stood about 10 steps away from the carriages. He found that all of his colleagues in the Overwatch Council seemed unreasonably nervous. These carriages were all specially made. The walls of the carriages were lined with iron plates. Perhaps the horses were tired or nervous, but they kept snorting. In such a tense atmosphere, Fan Xian couldn't help but frown. He thought of the rumors about the important figure who was about to be transferred out of prison. Xiao En, the head of Northern Wei's spies. Back in the day, he had countless riders under his command. He swept across the world, planting spies in every country. He was an expert at manipulating people's minds and was skilled at using poison. He had toppled the royal families of many small countries, and the number of people who had died at his hands, directly or indirectly, was enough to form a mountain of bones. Most frightening of all was that this once illustrious head of spies had an extremely brilliant mind and methods. Who knew how many times he had evaded assassination attempts from enemy countries? Back in the day, the king of Wei most relied on civil official Zhuang Mohan, and the military official he most relied on was Zhang Qingfeng. But the true pillar of the country was Xiao En, who had always been hidden in the shadows. At that time, the world was in chaos, and it was thanks to Xiao En's ruthlessness that he had eliminated some of the countries surrounding the kingdom of Qing. Not only did he bring Northern Wei territory, he also indirectly helped the kingdom of Qing stabilize its situation. But as the kingdom of Qing gradually rose, Xiao En's dark hand naturally reached south. In those years, the bureaucracy of the capital was in chaos. Before and after the death of the founding emperor, the two princes were at loggerheads, like fire and water. Behind this, of course, was Xiao En's instigation. Northern Wei's tens of thousands of riders had long been waiting for the two princes to fight for the throne. Then they would march south and swallow the kingdom of Qing into the kingdom of Wei. Coincidentally, at this moment, no one knew that a woman called Yi Qingmei had brought a blind young servant into the capital of the kingdom of Qing. The servant carried a black chest on his back. Thus, the two princes died mysteriously. Now that His Majesty's father, the previously peaceful Prince Cheng, had ascended to the throne, the kingdom of Qing did not suffer any real losses. The capital gradually settled down, and Northern Wei lost its best opportunity to invade. It was at this time that a man called Chen Pingping gradually appeared on the stage of history. Chen Pingping had originally been a servant in King Cheng's manor, but for some reason, he had gained the trust of King Cheng's crown prince and had followed him his entire life. And when the Overwatch Council, a strange and unconventional organization, was established, Chen Pingping became the head of the council and remained so until today. At first, people did not know what the Overwatch Council did, nor did they know that the shadow of the mistress of the Yi family was still behind the council. They only knew that Chen Pingping's ruthlessness was gradually revealed, and that his talent for manipulating the Dark Knight was also gradually revealed. The two most terrifying secret organizations in the world were subordinate to the two most powerful countries. As the situation between Northern Wei and the kingdom of Qing grew more and more tense, they began to secretly attack each other. One year, the kingdom of Qing finally took the risk of carrying out its first northern expedition. This action of smashing a rock with an egg finally failed miserably in front of Northern Wei, the most powerful country in the world. In front of Zhang Qingfeng's cavalry and Xiao En's heavy spy network, the crown prince, who was now the emperor, was repeatedly defeated and finally almost died in the mountains and rivers of the north. It was Chen Pingping who led a group of black knights through the treacherous battlefield that saved the crown prince's life. At the same time, he ordered the spies of the Overwatch Council hidden in Shangjing of Northern Wei to begin spreading rumors, bribing high-ranking officials, and framing General Zhang Qingfeng. After a number of sacrifices, a crack finally appeared in the battlefield in the mountains of the north. The road back to the kingdom was long and dangerous. Many times, when the troops were in desperate straits and ran out of food and water, Chen Pingping, who was not as old as he was now, expressionlessly left all the food for the crown prince and his subordinates, while he drank horse urine and ate grass. In the end, only a tenth of the Black Knights made it back to the capital. On the way back, he relied on a female prisoner of Dongyi to serve the crown prince, who was heavily injured and recovered. This female prisoner of Dongyi was the mother of the great prince of Qing, Lady Ning of the palace. Even after a long time, people were still guessing what kind of plot Chen Pingping had used to make a great general like Zhang Qingfeng lose the trust of the Northern Wei royal family. But no one had a real answer, not even the Empress Dowager of the Kingdom of Qing. Only some people vaguely knew that it was related to the secret affairs of the Empress of Northern Wei. From that day on, Chen Pingping gained the absolute trust of the emperor and the crown prince. At the same time, a phrase began to spread throughout the world. In the north was Xiao En, in the south was Chen Pingping. Chapter 183. The heavy iron door was slowly pulled open. The well-oiled mechanism did not creak, but this silent pressure made the people of the Overwatch Council, who were guarding the door, feel nervous. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly, and his left eyelid twitched. He felt a faint chill coming from behind the iron door. It seemed that this man, who should have been in his 70s or 80s, who should have lived only in the pages of history, after being imprisoned for 20 years, still exuded the aura of a secret agent. The sound of the iron chains dragging across the stone floor was somewhat ear-piercing. The sound grew louder and louder, indicating that the man inside was getting closer and closer to the iron door. Fan Xian raised his head and looked calmly at the iron door. He thought about how Chen Pingping had led the Black Knights in a surprise attack during the Second Northern Expedition, and how he had captured Xiaoan, who had secretly returned to his hometown to attend a wedding, and brought him back to Northern Qi. But because of this, Chen Pingping's legs were crippled. This Xiaoan was truly a powerful man. After Xiaoan was captured by the Kingdom of Qing, the Kingdom of Qing went on another northern expedition. After 3 northern expeditions, the once insufferably powerful Northern Wei was beaten to the brink of death. In the end, it split into countless smaller countries. Directly inheriting Northern Wei's power and most of its territory was the Northern Wei Jidushi, the Zhan family, who established the country as Qi. This was the origin of the Kingdom of Northern Qi. Back then, General Zhan Qingfeng had been demoted for no reason, and Northern Wei had fallen apart. In the end, it was the Zhan family who had emerged from this terrible mess. This was truly a strange thing. The spring sun shone gently through the tall trees outside the prison and onto the iron door, leaving mottled marks on the door. At the same time, it lightly imprinted itself on the old man's face. The sound of the iron chains dragging across the floor suddenly stopped, and an old sigh rang out. Outside the iron door, the 4 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council gripped their ropes tightly, as if they were facing a great enemy. They were far away from the shackles, and there was a man in the shackles. His hair was a mess, and his wrists and feet were shackled with steel, but his clothes were very clean. That old sigh came from the wrinkled lips under the disheveled hair. After the sigh, the old man faintly sighed again. The taste of sunlight, it's been a long time. This was, of course, Xiaoan, who had been locked up by the Kingdom of Qing for 20 years. Seeing him walk out of the celestial prison, the guards of the Overwatch Council grew nervous. It was as if they could smell the sweet scent of blood in the air. Fan Xian frowned slightly. This man's aura could easily drive someone mad. Everyone gripped their swords tightly in their hands, or their fingers tightened on the triggers of their crossbows, aiming at the tall but stooped old man. A dull thud resounded. The former head of the 7th Bureau, who is now a prison guard with turbid eyes, walked forward and smacked Xiaoan's back with a rod for no reason at all. Xiaoan didn't seem to feel anything. He slowly turned his head to look at the former head of the 7th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. He let out a soft breath and blew away his messy hair, revealing a pair of cold, serene eyes and a pair of withered lips. In a raspy voice, he said, "Old neighbor, we've lived together for 20 years. I'm about to leave, and you're just going to send me off like this?" The former head of the 7th Bureau slowly closed his eyes and lowered the rod in his hand, as if afraid of Xiaoan's eyes. He took 2 deep breaths and said, "These are all young people. Why must you provoke them? If they accidentally kill you now, I don't think you'll be satisfied." Xiaoan slowly blinked and looked at the handsome young man in the crowd surrounding him. Fan Xian noticed that he was looking at him. He forced his Jinqi to steady his mind and smiled back. Xiaoan was a little surprised that such a young man could be so calm. He shook his head and said to the prison guard, "I'm leaving the Kingdom of Qing. I don't think you'll have to stay in the celestial prison any longer. But I think you must be hoping that I'm dead. Otherwise, I'll find a way to make you pay me back for the 20 years we've been together." The prison guard was expressionless. "I wish you a safe journey. Don't ever come back." Xiaoan laughed hoarsely. "I'll definitely come back." He looked at the prison guard's face and said, emphasizing each word, "No matter how much you torture me, I'll use it on your children." The prison guard closed his eyes. He knew that if Xiao En could regain control of the dark forces of Northern Qi, then he would be able to exact his revenge on him. It would be extremely difficult for him to protect his family. Xiao En threw his head back and laughed. The heavy chains on his body began to clang, as if he was afraid that this terrifying figure would soon be freed. The people of the Overwatch Council were incredibly nervous. Only Fan Xian, hearing the hatred in his opponent's laughter, felt slightly nervous and narrowed his eyes. He still didn't understand why the eldest princess was playing this game. The air outside the Overwatch Council's prison was incredibly tense. It was as if there was a faint bloody light emanating from the man in the shackles. At that moment, there was a creaking sound, and the ordinary, black wheelchair slowly approached the shackles. Fei Jia was pushing the wheelchair, and Chen Pingping was sitting in it. The wheelchair didn't make a loud sound, but it was like a bell that shook everyone out of their nervousness. Everyone saw that the director had arrived, and for some reason, they all let out a collective sigh of relief. They were nervous facing Xiao En because they didn't know what this legendary figure would do once he was released from prison. Chen Pingping's arrival put everyone at ease because all the officials of the Overwatch Council deeply believed that as long as Director Chen was here, Xiao En could not rebel. Chen Pingping slowly raised his head and looked at the old acquaintance in the shackles. "What are you laughing at?" His voice carried a trace of disdain and a trace of amusement. Xiao En, with his head full of disheveled hair, looked at Chen Pingping in the wheelchair and suddenly said, "I'm laughing at the fact that your legs were destroyed by my hands." Chen Pingping smiled and shook his head. "I thought you were laughing at your tragic life. You've been locked up by me for 20 years. What else do you need to say? I'm the victor, and you're the loser. This is a fact that history has long determined, and you will never be able to change it." Xiao En roared, and his white hair flew back like swords. In his rage, he took 2 steps forward, and the chains shook violently. The 4 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau, who were holding the shackles, exerted all their strength to hold him back. The 2 forces clashed, and a cloud of dust rose in front of the prison. Chen Pingping, however, was not nervous at all. He looked at him with pity. "You're already so old. How can you still be so angry?" Xiao En suddenly closed his eyes and faced the sky. After a long time, he opened them again, and a cold light shone from them. "Chen Pingping, do you really dare to let me go back to the north?" Chen Pingping smiled. "Go back and enjoy your retirement. Behave yourself. I'm also old now, and I can't be bothered to go so far to catch you." Xiao En's voice was as sharp as a knife, and his aged voice was like the rust on a knife. It scraped against everyone's ears. "My son died by your hand at the wedding. I don't think you'll ever have the chance to catch me again." Chen Pingping waved his hand, and Fan Xian walked over with a smile on his face. The closer he got to Xiao En, the more he felt his innate coldness, but his expression remained unchanged. "We're already old. What else can you do? If one day I have to catch you." Chen Pingping smiled. "Xiao En, this is Fan Xian. He's my successor. He'll be with you on this trip to the north. I don't think you'll be lonely." Xiao En turned slightly, and the shackles clanged against the chains again. The old man gazed at this young, handsome official of the Overwatch Council through the strands of hair in front of his eyes. He didn't say anything for a while. Only now did Fan Xian see clearly the lingering hatred in Xiao En's eyes. Pushing the wheelchair, Fei Jia slowly said, "Sir Xiao En, I was the one who poisoned the wedding. Coincidentally, Fan Xian is my student." Chen Pingping and Fei Jia smiled at the same time. Fan Xian smiled at the perfect moment. "Senior Xiao En, if there's anything in the future, I'll be the one to accompany you." Xiao En chuckled, but there was no joy in his laughter. It was cold and murderous. His greatest defeat in this life had been given to him by Chen Pingping and Fei Jia. He had never imagined that the young man who would be escorting him back to the north would have such a deep connection with them. He tilted his head slightly to look at Fan Xian. "You're still too young. You'll have to be careful on the road." Fan Xian bowed politely. "I'll learn from you on the road." The grass by the side of the road was as fine as jade. Low branches hung in the sky beside the carriages. The silent carriages left the prison of the Overwatch Council and followed Tianhe Avenue to the north of the city. Along the way, the city patrol yamen had set up checkpoints. There was no one on the long street, only soldiers standing guard. In the distance, a few crossbowmen of the 6th Bureau could be seen, occupying the eaves of a few buildings. The side gate of the palace was closed. The commander of the palace, Gong Dian, looked coldly at the carriages in the distance. Suddenly he said, "I admire Fan Xian." The general beside him frowned. "Sir?" Gong Dian's lips curled up. "You've never had any dealings with Xiao, and so you don't know how dangerous this trip will be. Fan Xian's name is known throughout the land, and he's a member of the royal family. There's no need for him to go to northern Qi. But this kid has the guts to accept this mission. I really admire him." Fan Xian sat in the first carriage and closed his eyes to rest. The real diplomatic mission had left the capital the day before. Fan Xian and his entourage, including himself, had been delayed to the end because of the secret agreement to trade Xiao En for Yan Bingyun. Last night, he had prevented his family from seeing him off. His entire mind was focused on this mission. Fan Xian seemed to be falling asleep with a rise and fall of the carriage, but he was thinking about many things. Aside from Xiao En, Sea Lily's plan for the House of Red Sleeves was also very tricky. Only now did he remember that the gentle woman he had spent a night with was in the carriage behind him. He couldn't help but be slightly startled. At that moment, the carriage jolted. He knew that the carriage had rolled over the stone ridge at the north gate of the capital. Chapter 184. As soon as they left the capital, the sun dimmed. The carriages passed by the pavilion without stopping, and the willow trees on the main road sent them off as they slowly made their way north. The officers and soldiers of the city patrol escorted the diplomatic mission 18 miles out of the capital before returning, handing over the task of keeping an eye on the defenses along the way to the capital garrison. The diplomatic mission's primary means of transportation were carriages, and there were more than 10 of them. Aside from carrying people, most of the space was reserved for ceremonial preparations for the trip north. Xiao En's shackles had not been removed, and he was locked up in the second carriage. There was also an official from the Overwatch Council in charge of his daily life. The official smiled and carefully wiped the face of this serious criminal with a towel. The towel was very soft, and it did not hurt Xiao En's old and withered face. "If I capture you and use you to threaten that young man named Fan, would it have any effect?" The chains clinked, and Xiao En's old voice rang out in the carriage. But his words revealed a sense of carelessness, as if he had already guessed the answer. The official in charge of his daily life smiled warmly and said sincerely, "Mr. Xiao, since it is my turn to serve you, naturally I am prepared to be restrained by you. But as a citizen of the Kingdom of Qing, when the time comes, I will have to commit suicide by poison, so as not to make things difficult for the people of the council." Xiao En closed his eyes, and the cold aura around him gradually faded. "My hair is too long," he said quietly. "Help me tie it up." The conversation between the two seemed to have missed something. Xiao En was currently restrained by the chains, so how could he restrain this official of the Overwatch Council? Perhaps both of them knew that once they left the capital, these thin chains would not be able to restrain the terrifying Xiao En forever. The official walked to Xiao En's side and took out a comb from a small cupboard. He carefully combed Xiao En's snow-white hair, which reached his waist. His fingers were strangely steady and did not tremble in the slightest. Decades ago, Xiao En had been one of the few 9th-level masters in the world. If he had not been imprisoned in the Overwatch Council for 20 years, suffering great torture, and having his body and spirit damaged by the poisons of the Third Bureau, people would have guessed that he would have long ago become a Grandmaster. Even so, Bing, who still had some power, just by looking at the Overwatch Council's expression as if they were facing a great enemy when he came out of prison, as well as the power that naturally seeped out of his body, one could tell that this old man still possessed terrifying power. If Xiao En were to suddenly launch an attack at this moment, this middle-aged official probably wouldn't even have the slightest room to resist. However, he still maintained a steady smile, his expression calm and composed. Xiaoan glanced at him appreciatively. He knew that Xiaoan had most likely already made up his mind. Once he was subdued, he would immediately commit suicide by ingesting poison. He just didn't know where the poison was hidden on his body. Is the Qing kingdom really so good that you would willingly and even happily guard me, a demon, by my side? This was something that Xiaoan had always been puzzled about. The bureaucracy of the Qing kingdom was clearly corrupt, and yet the Northern Wei kingdom that he had once served had fallen apart overnight. Although part of this was because he and Zhang Qingfeng had been captured and lost their power, the Qing kingdom's military strength was still so tyrannical that it was somewhat illogical. The middle-aged official respectfully said, "If I die, the council will take care of my family's future. When my child turns 12, he can receive honors, and I believe that Sir Fan Jr. will help me take care of him. Sir Fan Jr. is very rich. My life can be exchanged for so many things. It is truly worth it." Xiaoan flexed his wrists, and the sound of chains rang out again. He was a little annoyed. "Still the same old tricks. What is your name?" The middle-aged official laughed and replied, "My name is Wang Qinian." Xiaoan's carriage was the second in line. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the driver's side and squinted at the carriage. He waved his hand to call over a tiger guard and quietly asked, "How are the people next to the carriage?" What were the tiger guards? This was back to the second conversation between Count Sinan and Director Chun Pingping outside the palace. In short, Minister Fan could not help but allocate a small portion of his secret power to the diplomatic mission just as his son was about to leave the country. These tiger guards were all extremely powerful. Although they could not compare to the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council in terms of killing, and could not compare to the 5th Bureau in terms of collective fighting power, these tiger guards were all carefully selected individuals. There was no need to doubt their loyalty to their master, and there was an indescribable fierceness about them. Of course, Fan Xian could vaguely guess that these tiger guards were actually controlled by his father on behalf of the emperor. Perhaps they also served to keep the Overwatch Council in check. But the power that kept the Overwatch Council in check was clearly not limited to the tiger guards. For Count Sinan to send these 7 tiger guards to accompany his son north, he must have received permission from the palace. Beside the first carriage was the leader of the tiger guards, surnamed Gouda. He respectfully replied, "Rest assured, young master. Although there are no people from the 6th Bureau, we can guarantee our safety." Because these tiger guards were nominally Minister Fan's private armed forces, he addressed Fan Xian as young master rather than sir. But Fan Xian still felt it was a little strange, and he smiled. The soldiers of the Jingdo garrison surrounded and protected this strange diplomatic mission as they slowly advanced north. The armored soldiers were a little silent. After all, this was an idle mission. But the generals who knew the inside story were a little uncomfortable. Their silence represented a kind of humiliation. For more than a decade, the reigning emperor had led the armies of the kingdom of Qing on expeditions to the east and to the west. They had never suffered a single defeat, and the kingdom of Qing's army had long since become accustomed to victory. Last year, in what was defined as an impulsive border war, the kingdom of Qing was still the victor. But no one could have imagined that the victorious kingdom of Qing would be forced to make such a huge concession because of some very despicable matter, sending Xiaoan back north with both hands. The rumors that Fan Xian had spread throughout the capital had long since spread to every corner of the world. So these generals also knew of the sinister role that the eldest princess had played in this matter. The military's dissatisfaction with the royal family seemed to be concentrated on that beautiful and crazy royal woman. This was something that Fan Xian still had no way of figuring out. Although the eldest princess was crazy, she was not stupid. What benefit did she gain from selling Mr. Yan, the head of Qing's northern spies, to northern Qi? If it was just to have Zhuang Mohan come to the capital to humiliate him, Fan Xian certainly did not believe that he had such an important position. If the eldest princess was seeking outside help from northern Qi for the sake of the future struggle for the throne, wouldn't this offend the majority of the military? No matter how he looked at it, this was a deal that did not make up for the losses. The diplomatic mission's carriages had already traveled north for half a day. The sun gradually sank into the mountains, and the light grew dimmer. The carriages began to rest by the edge of a large forest. The deputy commander of the diplomatic mission came to ask for instructions. According to the rules, the diplomatic mission should stop for the night at a relay station 3 miles ahead. Fan Xian thought for a while and then shook his head. He ordered that they stop there for now, and that they would discuss it later. He then got out of the carriage, stretched the numbness that came with being immobile for so long, and strolled to the rear. The leader of the Tiger Guards, hand on his long knife, silently followed behind him. Fan Xian looked down and noticed that the Tiger Guard's knife was strangely long. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "Will it be inconvenient to draw it?" Under Wu Zhu's guidance, he paid particular attention to reaction speed in battle. He knew that the longer the weapon, the slower the weapon's owner's reaction would be. The leader of the Tiger Guards, Gouda, raised his long knife and calmly presented it to Fan Xian. He explained, "There's a mechanism, so we can draw the knife faster. Because I'm mainly responsible for covering and intercepting, the 7 Tiger Guards in this party all use long knives. We just want to increase the killing range." Fan Xian nodded, indicating that he should not follow. By now, he had already reached the side of the second carriage. He gently twitched his nose, as if he could faintly smell the scent of blood and ice coming from the carriage. He couldn't help but smile, thinking that if Wang Qinian and that old freak continued to stay together, they would eventually go crazy. Sure enough, as soon as he saw Fan Xian enter the carriage, Wang Qinian stood at the door of the carriage with a pained expression. "Sir, when can I rest?" "Wait for another 2 days." Fan Xian smiled and patted his shoulder. "Has Xiao En made any strange moves?" Wang Qinian shook his head and calmly recounted Xiao En's every move for the past half an hour to Sir Fan. Fan Xian listened calmly. He knew that Wang Qinian's words would certainly fall into Xiao En's ears, but he was not worried. After a while, he quietly said, "I'll go in and take a look." "It's dangerous." Wang Qinian shook his head disapprovingly. A sick tiger is still a tiger. Although Xiao En is not as strong as he was once a 9th-level fighter. If you're not careful and he captures you, what should we do? Fan Xian replied, "Don't worry. Xiao En is not an idiot. We're only a few miles from the capital. If he tries anything strange at this time, he'll be seeking his own death." Of course, he knew of Xiao En's terrifying power. What did a 9th-level fighter mean? He only had to think of the time when he had snuck into the palace at night and Yan Xiaoyi's arrow, which seemed to come from beyond the heavens, to understand. "And we'll be traveling together for a long time. Am I not going to see him?" Fan Xian laughed. In the gloomy carriage, Xiao En's face was gloomy. His white hair had long since been tied up. Fan Xian held the small box he was carrying. He lifted the curtain and entered with a smile. "Mr. Xiao, we're going to northern Qishangjing. It's a long way. Let's get some food and water first." Xiao En slowly opened his eyes, and a cold light flashed in them. He smiled. "Thank you for your hard work, Sir Fan." Fan Xian did not seem to fear Xiao En's methods at all. With a face full of smiles, he opened the lunchbox and carefully fed the desserts to the old man's still somewhat dry lips. Then he fed him some water. After a moment of silence, Xiao En suddenly said, "These poisons are useless." Chapter 185. Naturally, the pastries contained Fan Xian's meticulous concoctions. They were essential for every household, and on this trip to the north, he could not afford to miss out on some good poison. Given Xiao En's status, he would not resort to trickery. Seeing that Xiao En had seen through him, Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "I believe that this powder has no smell at all. How did Mr. Xiao En detect it?" Xiao En looked at him, then slowly closed his eyes. "You are Fei Jie's student. No matter how you try to come up with your own ideas, you cannot escape Fei Jie's domain. In your prison, I ate Fei Jie's poisons for more than 10 years. He and Chen Pingping could not bear to kill me, so they could only use these poisons to damage my meridians. If it were you, eating pastry from a stall for more than 10 years, and suddenly one day, The old master of the stall takes in a new disciple and makes another pastry. Although it is made to taste like scallion oil, I think you would still be able to taste that it is from that stall. Deep in Fan Xian's heart, he sighed and said, "It's probably because the amount of flour and water at each stall is different."
Yes.
Xiao En smiled, but his smile was chilling. It is the same with poisons. For an old man like me, the taste of poisons is no longer about the taste but the texture. Fan Xian opened his mouth, wanting to say something. In the end, he just smiled and sighed. What kind of realm is this? This is the realm of eating poisons, as if they were rice. Since Xiaoan could taste the poison in the pastries and still ate them calmly, the poison must have had no effect. Fan Xian continued with a smile. There are 3 great masters of poisons in the world. My teacher is one and the other is dead. I almost forgot that Mr. Xiao En was one of the 3. You have overestimated yourself. Xiao En flexed his wrists, and the chains clinked as Fan Xian delivered fresh water into his hands. After finishing the bowl of water, Xiao En suddenly closed his eyes and smiled. What if I have to go to the toilet? There is a toilet in the carriage. The sun is good outside. The sun has already set. It is good to see the night sky of the kingdom of Qing. The night is cold, and the dew is heavy. Sir, you are old. You should stay in the carriage and rest. Of the 2, one old and one young, one closed his eyes and spoke softly, while the other responded with a smile. Xiaoan opened his eyes and said calmly, I've been in prison for many years, and I've only seen a sliver of sunlight at the gate. Master Fan, would you allow me to go out and have a look? Fan Xian shook his head firmly, but a smile still hung on his face. It's very dangerous. I'm not dangerous. Shan said gently, since you have already reached an agreement with the North, anyone with the slightest bit of intelligence would know that following the diplomatic mission safely is the wisest choice for me. Fan Xian replied calmly, Mr. Xiao, before leaving the capital, the security of the diplomatic mission is the responsibility of the capital garrison. I think you should be able to guess why the kingdom of Qing is willing to return you to northern Qi. This is a very humiliating matter, so I am very worried that if you really do get off the carriage with your hands and feet shackled, many arrows might suddenly fly from afar and turn you into a porcupine. Xiao En knew that the words of this young man from the enemy kingdom were not false. He smiled and said, Don't you want to kill me? If I return to the north, within 3 years, I will certainly cause unbearable damage to your kingdom. Fan Xian shook his head. His handsome face was filled with confidence. I am not of the older generation, so I only have the respect of legends. I never thought that even if you returned to the north, you would still be able to summon wind and rain as you did in the past. Of course, if I could kill you, that would be the simplest way to deal with it. But in comparison, I value the safety of the bargaining chip I exchanged with you more. So rest assured, I will ensure your life, all the way to the capital of northern Qi, and hand you over to your friends. Xiao En was silent. Fan Xian smiled and said, Up until now, I am still unable to accurately determine how much power you currently have, so I will be very careful along the way. As for the outside of your carriage, I will maintain sufficient power at all times to ensure that when you want to come out of the carriage to get some fresh air, we will be able to immediately respond accordingly. Xiao En laughed, but still did not say anything. Since his attempt to secretly poison Xiao En had been seen through, and it was clearly ineffective, then he could only resort to the barbaric method on the surface. Fan Xian let out a soft breath, then stood up. He stretched out his foot and stepped on the iron chains that bound Xiao En's hands. Strangely, he tied a piece of black cloth around Xiao En's elbow, then gently but rudely patted the back of the old man's hand. Then, he took out a flat iron box from his bosom. Opening it, he took out a long, thin, and incredibly sharp needle. The thin needle tube was skillfully made hollow, and there was a bulge at the back of the long needle. It was unknown what material it was made of, but presumably it was a medicine storage device. Xiao En's eyes were bloodshot, and he stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian approached with the needle in hand, without a trace of panic. Suddenly, a very strange feeling arose in the carriage. Fan Xian's nose suddenly tasted something sweet, and the air was filled with the scent of blood, faintly red. This smell came from Xiao An's faintly angry body. Outside the carriage, the Tiger Guards and officials of the Overwatch Council immediately sensed the abnormality in the carriage. They silently rushed over, weapons in their hands. Wang Qinian, who was guarding the carriage, looked back and frowned slightly. He then waved his hand at the people beside the carriage, who looked as if they were facing a great enemy, indicating that there was no problem. In the carriage, Fan Xian slowly removed the thin needle from the back of Xiao An's hand. He took out a silk handkerchief and carefully wiped the tip of the needle, then raised his head and smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Xiao, for your cooperation." He did not know what acupoint the needle had pierced, nor did he know what medicine had been poured into the needle. Xiao An's frightening aura had weakened considerably, and even his face seemed a little haggard. "I respect you, but respect the elderly." Fan Xian walked out of the carriage. "But you must remember, you are no longer the head spy of Northern Wei, nor are you a world-shaking villain. You are only my prisoner. If you try to escape, I have many ways to kill you." "Sir, there is no need to be so careful." Wang Qinian accompanied him to sit under a tree by the road. He looked at Fan Xian's slightly tired face. "If Xiao An wants to regain his freedom, he should cooperate with us and enter the borders of Northern Qi." Fan Xian shook his head. "You don't understand. For someone like Xiao An, even if he had been imprisoned for 10 or 20 years, so what? Look at his eyes. What is there other than hatred? There is also the frightening insight and the burning ambition. If he only wants freedom, then he will cooperate with us. But if he wants more, then he will certainly find a way to escape. The Overwatch Council's prison keeps a close eye on him, so he doesn't have a sliver of a chance. However, on this long road to the north, he has too many opportunities. Thus, I have to think of all ways to weaken his fighting ability and desire to fight while ensuring his survival. Why would he want to escape? Because the regime in the north is not the Northern Wei that he has served for many years and was even imprisoned for. It is Northern Qi." Fan Xian smiled. Although the royal family of Northern Qi is the Zhan family, and Marshal Zhan Qingfeng was on good terms with Xiao An, the dynasty is changed. Xiao An has been imprisoned for so many years, and I don't know how the royal family of the north will treat him. If the royal family of Northern Qi feels that he still has value, then naturally they will treat him as an honored guest. But if there's no such benefit, think about it. If the royal family of Northern Qi goes crazy, will they allow a terrifying spy leader like Xiao An to establish a foothold in Shanjing again? Then why is Northern Qi willing to trade Master Yan for Xiao An? Because of two people. Fan Xian didn't go into detail. One is Zhuang Mohan and the other. I guess it should be that famous northern general called Shang Shanhu. Sir, do you think that Xiao An risked his life to escape because he doesn't trust the royal family of Northern Qi? Fan Xian thought of what Wu Zhu had said to him, and sighed faintly. People in our line of work don't trust anyone. As for Xiao An, he must have other plans, but I can't guess what they are. All I know is that he must reach Shangjing alive. It's that simple. Where will Xiao An make his move? Before leaving the country. If he enters Northern Qi, then even if he escapes, it will still be Northern Qi's responsibility, Fan Xian said lightly. Since Xiao An wants Northern Qi to recognize his position, he can't mess up this agreement, said Fan Xian lightly. He suddenly stood up and yelled, "Today we won't go to the relay station. We'll set up camp in the wilderness." His subordinates responded in unison and went to organize the arrangements for setting up camp. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian with some doubt. Fan Xian shook his head. It's a bit of training and getting used to it. After leaving Songzhou, there won't be any relay stations in the north that can be used. Taking advantage of the fact that we're not far from the capital, let your subordinates get used to the atmosphere as quickly as possible. Fighting in the wilderness is not playing house. Wang Qinian saw that Fan Xian was still worried and very tactfully began to play the role of a sidekick. Fan Xian lightly clapped his hands, smiled, and waved for him to leave. Then he sat silently under the tree, looking at the carriage and thinking about the old man inside. I don't want you to suddenly change your name to Shawshank. Earlier, when injecting poison into the carriage, Fan Xian had still been a little nervous. He didn't know whether or not Xiao En would suddenly attack. After several investigations, he still didn't know how much power this ninth-level ace, who was one of the best in the world, had retained after more than 10 years in prison. But he knew that until the best opportunity came, the terrifying Xiao En would be very obedient. The mountain wind blew from the forest behind Fan Xian, blowing through the sweat-soaked clothes on his back. It was damp and cold. After a while, he stood up, expressionless, and walked towards Sea Lily's carriage. Chapter 186. Time can change many things, including a person's appearance and mental state, but there are exceptions. When Fan Xian stepped into Sea Lily's carriage, the first thing he saw was a slightly haggard, but still beautiful woman. Half a year in prison did not seem to have done any damage to the face of the most popular woman on Lujing River. Seeing Fan Xian enter, Sea Lily bowed slightly. Her eyes were slightly flustered, as if she did not know how to address him. It seemed that she was not prepared for this meeting. Fan Xian quietly looked at the girl's face. He found that her eyebrows were still soft like willow branches, and her black eyes were still moving. However, her lips had not been colored today, so they looked a little pale. When the two of them first met, Fan Xian was the illegitimate son of a nobleman who had just arrived in the capital. Sea Lily was already the most popular woman on Lujing River. That night, he caressed her crazily. Although he had not truly reached ecstasy, he had done all the most intimate things between a man and a woman. But he had not expected that Sea Lily was a spy planted in the Qing kingdom by Northern Qi. Through the second prince's invitation, she and Wu Bowen had set up a plan to assassinate Fan Xian. Fan Xian was lucky enough to escape that disaster. In the end, he entered the Overwatch Council, and now he had taken on the duty of returning Sea Lily to Northern Qi. He quietly looked at the eyes, nose, and lips of the woman in front of him. For some reason, he thought of the physical contact he had with her that night on the pleasure boat. Although his heart did not waver, there was still an indescribable feeling. After all, aside from the servant girls in Danzhou, she was the woman he had been closest to before marriage. A few days ago, I rode by Lujing River. The silence in the carriage was broken by Fan Xian's gentle words. I saw that pleasure boat again. Sea Lily was slightly taken aback. She had not expected this handsome young man to use such a line as an opening remark. She had thought that what followed would be a very serious conversation. Fan Xian laughed. It's already very run down, but I don't think you will miss that place. Sea Lily smiled bitterly. I am a duckweed, a guest on the four seas. Please do not make fun of me, sir. I don't like the word me. Fan Xian looked at her watery eyes and smiled slightly. The affairs of the world are wondrous. When you wanted to kill me, it was because you had a mission. Although I won't forgive you, I won't hold any prejudice against you because of it. At the time in the Overwatch Council prison, I told you that as long as you gave up the mastermind, I would think of a way to let you live. However, I want to tell you clearly that I did not do anything to allow you to return to Northern Qi, so you don't need to thank me. Sea Lily raised her head in surprise. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. She couldn't understand this young man, who was sometimes pure and amiable, and sometimes cold and terrifying. Why did he say such things? From the day you left the prison, we've been colleagues. Fan Xian sat next to her and relaxed against the carriage. His nose picked up a faint fragrance, knowing that it was the girl's body fragrance. He enjoyed it a little and said, I don't know about the agreement between you and Qin Pingping, but since he believes you can be trusted, I will trust you. I hope you can trust me too, and that we can carry out the House of Red Sleeves plan. Sea Lily's hands clutched her lake green sleeves. She gently bit her lower lip, not knowing what to say. Give me a massage. I have to be on edge every day, not knowing when that old monster in the carriage will go berserk. It's a little stressful. Fan Xian wasn't lying. He really did look tired. Sea Lily made a sound of agreement and turned her body to the side. She knelt on the soft cushion of the seat and carefully placed her soft, warm hands on Fan Xian's head. She slowly rubbed it. Fan Xian closed his eyes and enjoyed the comfortable feeling in his head. He enjoyed the slow touch of Sea Lily's fingers and subconsciously sighed. What is it? Do you think it's too heavy? He didn't know what method Chen Pingping had used, but Sea Lily was no longer as desperate and determined as she had been in prison. Instead, she had returned to the way she had been on the pleasure boat, gentle and charming. Her soft voice slid across Fan Xian's heart. Fan Xian said gently, I was just thinking about how I tortured you. I was afraid I would break your beautiful little hands. Sea Lily's fingers, which had been rubbing Fan Xian's temples, paused. After a while, she said quietly, It's not that easy to break someone's hands. Don't hold a grudge. That won't be good for our cooperation in Shangjing, Fan Xian said quietly. He didn't open his eyes. You wanted to kill me, and I only tortured you. No matter how you look at it, you owe me. Sea Lily bit her lower lip again. Her pearly white teeth pressed against her lips, creating a soul-stealing charm. A soft light flickered in her eyes. I owe you. You can take it back at any time.
How?
Like the first night? Fan Xian opened his eyes, full of mockery. Sea Lily stubbornly opened her eyes to meet his. After a long silence, she looked at this handsome, young official. For some reason, she thought of the shameful incident that night on the pleasure boat. Her body felt soft and weak. She slowly leaned over, half leaning on Fan Xian's shoulder. Her fingers kept massaging him, and she said quietly, All women in this world have a hard life. I don't know how you intend to take it. That night on the pleasure boat, Fan Xian had used an aphrodisiac, so Sea Lily's reaction had been extremely strong, and she had remembered it to this day. Later, in the prison, Fan Xian had mercilessly tortured her. Aside from her hatred, she also had a very strange feeling. Fan Xian felt a springy softness on his right shoulder. Without thinking, he knew it was Sea Lily's soft chest. He thought she was trying to seduce him, so he took a deep breath to calm his mind. Unexpectedly, he inhaled the faint fragrance of a young woman. His heart stirred. He turned his head and smiled. Where did that ceiling go? He's still locked up in the capital. Sea Lily's face showed no expression. It seemed that Sea Ling wasn't her real family. Fan Xian became more and more curious. What method had Chen Pingping used to make Sea Lily listen to the Overwatch Council? He thought for a moment, then frowned. You're not a pitiful person. At least, the young emperor of Northern Qi still remembers you. Sea Lily furrowed her brows and sighed. How long will it last if you use your looks to influence others? That's what I'm confused about. Fan Xian smiled. I don't know if you can tell me in detail about your past with the Emperor of Northern Qi, so that when we get to Shangjing, we can make arrangements for you to enter the palace. The so-called Red Sleeve Plan, in Fan Xian's eyes, was just another version of Shi Shi's entry into Wu. From the contents of this secret agreement, it could be seen that the Emperor of Northern Qi had some affection for Sea Lily. Otherwise, he wouldn't have deliberately emphasized her return. But Sea Lily's background was a bit low. Even if Northern Qi respected her for her service to the country, it was only respect. Compared to the kingdom of Qing, Northern Qi paid more attention to one's birth and bloodline. They couldn't allow a woman who had once been a prostitute to enter the palace. Sea Lily didn't seem to want to talk about the past. She only lowered her head and said quietly, Master Fan, don't worry. Once I get to Shangjing, the Emperor of Northern Qi will worry about what happens next. The carriage once again fell silent. Fan Xian sat beside the woman, smelling her faint fragrance. For some reason, he regretted leaving her fingers earlier. After sitting quietly for a while, he slowly opened his mouth and said, Then rest well, Mississippi. Unexpectedly, Sea Lily spoke at the same time. Master, do you want a massage? That's fine. Fan Xian replied quickly. All right. There was a trace of disappointment in Sea Lily's reply. It wasn't until this strange question and answer session was over that the atmosphere in the carriage became a bit strange. It was as if they had all vaguely sensed something. A wave of ambiguity began to brew, and the air gradually grew warmer. Sea Lily bit her lower lip again and knelt on the chair. She pressed down on Fan Xian's shoulders with both hands, secretly applying pressure. She thought to herself that she just didn't want to stay alone in the carriage, so she was willing to serve her enemy. Fan Xian smiled, feeling the soft body of the woman behind him. He thought to himself, not only does this woman not hold a grudge, but she's purposely trying to please me. Why? Could it be that she likes me? As soon as he made this guess, Fan Xian hurriedly slapped himself in the face. He warned himself that although he was panned and he wasn't someone who emitted the scent of an aphrodisiac. Why did he want to stay in Sea Lily's carriage? Fan Xian frowned, trying to find an answer to convince himself. Perhaps there was some unease in his heart about going to Northern Qi, or perhaps it was because Shaoan was too ugly, or perhaps he was nothing at all. He was a normal man, and Sea Lily was a beautiful woman whose naked body he had once touched. Wanting to stay with her was a very normal thing. Fan Xian didn't linger long in the land of tenderness. He considered himself a lustful man, but he was also a man of unswerving determination. He wouldn't be unable to extricate himself from the tenderness. He just let Sea Lily massage his body to get rid of some of his tiredness, and then he stepped out of the carriage. Wang Qinian went to greet him and accompanied him to the back of the envoy's carriage. He said quietly, "Master, be careful of the eyes and ears around you. After all, Sea Lily will be given to the Emperor of Northern Qi. In the future, you will be staying in the carriage for so long. Let me clear the area first, lest any rumors spread to Shangjing and affect your future plans." Fan Xian knew that his confidant was thinking the wrong thing, but he didn't say anything. He just gently rubbed his temples. Chapter 187. After leaving the capital, the diplomatic mission immediately sped up. Along the way, they were no longer accompanied by the disdainful gazes of the garrison generals from afar. The members of the diplomatic mission, including the officials of the Overwatch Council, appeared to be much more relaxed. It was now the 3rd month of spring, and the further north they went, the richer the colors of spring became. It was truly a strange sight. Along the way, there were local officials who received them. They all knew that this diplomatic mission was headed to Northern Qi, and naturally, none of the officials dared to slight them. Furthermore, the leader of this diplomatic mission was the famous Sir Fan Jr., so the local officials were especially attentive in receiving them. Although they did not dare to delay the diplomatic mission schedule, every time they arrived, there was always a feast. Beautiful women came to keep them company, and at the banquet, there was no stopping flattery for Fan Xian. Only now did Fan Xian realize how famous he was in the kingdom of Qing. He couldn't help but feel a little smug, and at the beginning of the banquets, he refused no one. But after going so many times, he couldn't help but grow tired. And every time, he had to repeat his vow that he would no longer compose poetry. It was truly troublesome. Wang Qinian quite liked going, because the dancers at the banquets wore light muslin, and it was very entertaining. Every time they went, the local officials would extravagantly arrange for the local popular girls to accompany them. Every night, they would have hundreds of tricks up their sleeves. How could the sallow women in the capital compare? But this arrangement did not appeal to Fan Xian, because there was a girl in the diplomatic mission that even the Emperor of Northern Qi could not forget, Sea Lily, the most popular girl in the capital. As a result, Fan Xian gradually stopped attending banquets. He only chose to speak with some of his father's old acquaintances and high-ranking officials. Most of the time, he stayed at the diplomatic mission's encampment. On the one hand, he watched over Shaoan, and on the other, he could spend more time in Sea Lily's carriage. Counting on his fingers, it had been more than half a month since they left the capital. During this time, Fan Xian spent most of his time in Sea Lily's carriage. That's right. A group of men would get tired of listening to the crosstalk. How could it compare to chatting with a beautiful woman in a carriage? Sea Lily carefully peeled the orange, then carefully scraped away the white tendons before putting the orange into Fan Xian's mouth. In the diplomatic mission, Fan Xian was the most powerful, and the officials of the Overwatch Council followed his lead. The Tiger Guards were even more loyal. No matter what he did, no one dared to say anything. But as Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly chewed on the orange, for some reason, he thought of his sister. When he was in the capital, Roro often served him fruits like this. Then he thought of his wife, Wanner, who was still at home. His eyes opened slightly, and through a small crack in his eyelids, he peeked at Sea Lily, who was concentrating on processing the oranges. A sense of unease welled up in his heart. During the journey, he and Sea Lily didn't do much. They just chatted, ate some fruit, and passed the time. They didn't even mention their plans for Shangjing in the northern Qi kingdom. Of course, they occasionally rubbed their tired bodies, held hands, or hugged each other to look at the scenery outside the window. What are you thinking about? Seeing Fan Xian in a daze, Sea Lily smiled sweetly. These days together, all she saw was Fan Xian's gentle and delicate side. She had actually forgotten the horrible scene of him bullying the weak in the celestial prison. The girl seemed to like the feeling of sitting and chatting in the carriage. Deep in her heart, she secretly hoped that the journey would never end. I'm thinking, you've been taking good care of yourself these days. Your plumpness is gradually returning. Fan Xian teased. When we first left the capital, your body made my hands hurt. Sea Lily blushed slightly. Then don't touch me. Fan Xian smiled and took her hand. Holding her wrist, he pulled her into his arms. His palm slowly stroked her body. You don't like it? I've had a hard life. You bullied me, drugged me on the pleasure boat, tortured me in the celestial prison, and now I can't escape your evil clutches in this carriage. Sea Lily said this, but her whole body was in Fan Xian's arms. She felt that this young man's embrace was very warm, and she didn't want to leave. She felt Fan Xian's hand moving on her bottom, through her clothes. Her heartbeat was a little erratic. Her red lips opened slightly, and she blew into Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian's ear felt hot and itchy, and his palm unconsciously tightened. Sea Lily called out softly, her voice like silk. She panted softly in his ear. Take me. Going to Shangjing won't end well anyway. After a moment, Fan Xian smiled and jumped out of the carriage. There was a hint of strangeness in his smile. There was poison in Sea Lily's body, a slow-acting poison. Fan Xian had long found out that it had been planted by the Overwatch Council in advance. Fan Xian had seen this poison in the books teacher Fei had left behind, but he had never seen it in real life. This poison would slowly spread through a woman's body and then spread to a man through intercourse. As long as the Northern Qi Emperor and Sea Lily slept together, he could be infected with this poison. The symptoms were very similar to a common venereal disease. No wonder Qin Pingping was so serious. It turned out that the House of Red Sleeves was not a copy of Shi Shi entering Wu, but a plan to poison people. There was no cure for this poison, but it could effectively weaken a person's body and mind. Think about it. If the Northern Qi Emperor really loved Sea Lily and spent every night with her, he would soon fall seriously ill. And given the current situation of the Northern Qi Emperor and the Emperor's factions confronting each other, if the young Emperor fell seriously ill, Northern Qi's court would once again descend into chaos. Fan Xian sighed. Sea Lily knew there was poison in her body, but she thought it was just a method the Overwatch Council used to control her. She didn't know it could be transmitted to the men she slept with. What made him uncomfortable was that Qin Pingping hadn't told him about this. If he hadn't felt something strange when he was intimate with Sea Lily, he wouldn't have discovered it. Of course, even if he had been infected with this poison, he could immediately be cured, but the feeling of being kept in the dark was still not good. The House of Red Sleeves? He smiled bitterly in his carriage. So it's the House of White Sleeves, to summon the soul. He knew that compared to Qin Pingping, Fei Jie, and even Xiao and in the carriage behind him, his methods were not vicious enough, and his heart was not cold enough. Sea Lily was just a pawn that could be discarded at any time. But he didn't know what Qin Pingping had promised her to make her willingly become a pawn covered by a black cloth. But what truly shocked Fan Xian was something else. This was the real reason why nothing had actually happened between Fan Xian and Sea Lily for more than 10 days. Sea Lily was still a virgin. The diplomatic mission had already arrived in the northern part of the kingdom of Qing. Ahead of them was the last large city in the north of the kingdom of Qing, Songzhou. Looking at the city from a distance, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. He found that the color of the sky had darkened. The northern wind was strong and had scattered the spring air in all directions. Dark clouds covered the sky. It was truly an unpleasant weather. After the last provincial guard in charge of escorting them came to salute, they began to turn back. Only the diplomatic mission's own carriages were left. Although the carriages were very long, in the wasteland outside Songzhou, they still seemed small and pitiful. How long will it take to leave Songzhou and reach the border? Fan Xian squinted and gazed at the northern sky. Wang Qinian respectfully replied, "This time, we're going around the lake, so it's a bit further. It'll take at least 20 days. Fan Xian frowned. The real danger should be in these 20 days. He tilted his head slightly and looked at the carriage that had remained silent all this time. How is Shaoen's current condition? Sir, you've been injecting him with a large dose of poison every day. I'm guessing he's been working hard to force the poison out, so he's been very quiet. Ever since he woke up a few days ago, he's become very quiet. It seems he's thinking about something. Be careful." Fan Xian sniffed. It seemed that the smell of blood in the carriage was getting stronger. "Yes, sir." Wang Qinian asked for instructions. The provincial guard has already retreated. The Songzhou army is not at ease. Sir, you know what happened last time when Sea Lily was escorted back to the capital? Fan Xian smiled. Don't worry. Once we pass Songzhou, we'll be the most at ease in terms of escorting them. I'm only worried about the internal problems of the diplomatic mission. As soon as he finished speaking, a group of cavalry appeared on a low hill far away from the edge of the wasteland. There were about 500 of them, and they were all wearing black armor. Under the dim sunlight, they emanated a cold, murderous aura. Wang Qinian smiled. So the Black Knights are here. Then there's nothing to worry about. A gust of wind blew past, causing the gravel on the ground to roll. Wang Qinian and Fan Xian prepared to board the carriage and head toward Songzhou. Fan Xian suddenly stopped and slowly turned his head. He found that Sea Lily had already stepped out of the carriage and was standing beside it, looking at him with a perplexed expression. Get someone to give Miss C more clothes. The further north we go, the colder it gets. Spring comes so damn late. Fan Xian seemed to speak calmly, but his heart trembled. These days, he had rarely seen Sea Lily's carriage. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian strangely, then waved his subordinates away. There were 3 handmaidens in the diplomatic mission. They were there to serve Sea Lily, the future wife of the Emperor of Northern Qi. But Fan Xian had been in Sea Lily's carriage for the past few days, so the 3 handmaidens could only follow behind the convoy. After a while, the handmaidens came to Sea Lily's side. They gave her a crimson cloak and advised her to return to the carriage to rest. Sea Lily allowed them to put the cloak on her, but she did not return to the carriage. She only looked at Fan Xian quietly, as if trying to figure out something from his face. The Black Knights in the distance, the frail woman in the crimson cloak close by, and the pale white sun hanging in the sky. It was a beautiful picture, but one that made one's heart feel powerless. Chapter 188. After leaving Songzhou, the diplomatic mission, under the protection of the Black Knights, slowly but surely made their way north. Northern Qi was not to the north of the kingdom of Qing, but to the northeast. At the border of the 2 countries was a large number of powerless vassal states. On the easternmost coast was the largest city in the world, the most prosperous port, Dongyi. The route the diplomatic mission chose did not pass through the vassal states because the more cities they passed through, the harder it would be to guard against them. Of course, the secret agreement between the 2 countries could not be carried out by Dongyi. If the once demented Sigu Jian suddenly went crazy and provoked a war between the 3 countries, who could bear the consequences? So the diplomatic mission followed the wasteland north, and then took a detour to the east at the Great Lake. Although the journey was a little long, it was quiet. Aside from a few mounted brigands, There shouldn't be any powerful forces with ill intentions. Silence. Xiao En was silent. Si Lily was silent. Even the most important person in the diplomatic mission, Fan Xian, was silent. Everyone had their own reasons for being silent. Fan Xian pulled the needle out of Xiao En's hand and carefully examined the old man's weary face. Xiao En suddenly opened his eyes and a cold light shone from them, as if it were real. He smiled. I am thick-skinned. I am not afraid of being stared at. I have a question. Xiao En slowly closed his eyes. Why did you tie that cloth around my arm? I can guess. This method makes my blood vessels stand out even more. But was it necessary for you to inject poison into my blood vessels so painstakingly? Yes. Fan Xian smiled. Intravenous injection was, of course, faster and fiercer than food poisoning. No one in the world knew how to use intravenous injection, but that did not mean Fan Xian did not know how to do it. The terrifying Xiao En in front of him could not be affected by ordinary poisons, and his jinqi was too astonishing. Only an intravenous injection would be effective. Xiao En frowned. After a while, he suddenly said, "This method seems familiar, and I must admit, it is very effective. Unfortunately, I am really old and have forgotten who it was." Fan Xian was shocked, but his face showed no reaction. He smiled. Take your time, Mr. Xiao. Those cavalrymen in the distance should be Qin Pingping's underlings, right? Xiao En suddenly said in a very casual tone. Fan Xian was slightly taken aback. He remembered that his carriage had no windows on either side, and that it was separated by a layer of iron plates. It was amazing that Qin Pingping knew about the situation of the Black Knights in the distance. He replied warmly, "It is the Black Knights. That year's 1,000-mile raid was carried out by the ancestors of this cavalry." He was referring to the time, many years ago, when Qin Pingping had led the Black Knights to abduct Xiao En from his wedding. That incident was the greatest humiliation Xiao En had ever suffered in his life, and it had left him with an indelible wound. "When are you going to kill me?" Xiao En asked in a very ordinary tone. There was not a trace of emotion in his voice. There was some kind of psychological hypnosis hidden in this series of questions. If it was an ordinary person, they might have subconsciously fallen into the trap. But Fan Xian was not an ordinary person. He was a little surprised and said, "What?" Sean smiled faintly, and a faint redness appeared in his squinted eyes. "I think Qin Pingping would not want me to return to the north." Fan Xian shook his head. "I don't care about the thoughts of the older generation. As long as I do my job well, that's all." "You are a very good young man." Xiao En looked at him calmly. He slowly moved his wrist and put the heavy iron chain on the table. "Why do you say that, Mr. Xiao? We traveled together for many days. Although Master Fan often stayed in that girl's carriage, you did not forget your duty because you were greedy for the pleasures of the night." Xiao En said calmly, "The key is that you train twice a day, in the morning and at night. You never stopped. This kind of perseverance, even when I was young, was far inferior to you." Fan Xian smiled. "Clumsy birds fly early. I know my strength is not enough, and my talent is not enough. Naturally, I have to train more." Xiao En shook his head. "Your talent is very good, and your strength is already very strong. But you have never challenged a truly strong individual, so you have not been able to stimulate the true strength of your body." Fan Xian quietly looked at the old man's aged face. His eyes were as deep as an ancient well. He couldn't help but think to himself, "Are you the first truly strong individual I will face alone?" After leaving Songzhou, the diplomatic mission entered the area under the jurisdiction of the Northern Army. This was a grassland and the military camp was 100 miles away. Fan Xian did not want to encounter the superior 9th-level Yan Xiaoyi, so the diplomatic mission naturally took a detour. In any case, with the protection of the Black Knights along the way, no one in the world would dare to do anything to them. A few days ago, there had been a few mountain bandits who had sent scouts to investigate, but seeing the power of the diplomatic mission and the Black Knights in front of them, they had long since retreated into the mountains in fear, not daring to come out for months. Xiao En remained silent, and so did Si Lily. She gradually became more and more haggard. Fan Xian looked coldly at the two people he had escorted, but he didn't know what he was thinking. After these days together, for some reason, he felt a little pity for Sea Lily. First, he felt pity for her past, and second, he felt pity for her future misfortune. But Fan Xian was confident that his mind was clear. He would not do anything to save something small and lose something big. If something really did happen between him and Sea Lily, then the Overwatch Council's plans in Northern Qi would be a big problem. He didn't know how the young emperor of Northern Qi knew that Sea Lily was still a virgin. But if he found out that Sea Lily had lost her chastity, then the Red Sleeve plan would naturally be rendered useless. But Fan Xian didn't seem to want to see Sea Lily's somewhat confused face. It seemed that he didn't have enough confidence in himself, so he never boarded Sea Lily's carriage again. Instead, he boarded Xiao An's carriage more often. From this seemingly silent old man, he learned a lot of gossip and Jianghu's secrets from many years ago. On the one hand, he really wanted to learn a lot from this once most terrifying spy leader. On the other hand, Fan Xian didn't want Xiao An to have too much time to plan a contingency plan. As the journey progressed and the temperature outside the carriage dropped, the conversation between the shadowy figures of old and young gradually shifted from Northern Wei to the present world. No one can truly unify the world, Xiao An said lightly, looking at him. These days, he had gradually gotten used to the conversation between him and Fan Xian. This young official named Fan Xian was indeed a good person to talk to. His Majesty the Emperor of our country had 2 chances. The first was after the Third Northern Expedition. Fan Xian frowned. Given the kingdom of Qing's immense military power at the time, it was more than enough to go north and destroy Northern Qi. Xiao An shook his head. Although I was already in prison at the time and didn't hear any news, after listening to your explanation these days, I think that the Emperor of Qing suddenly stopped because of 2 reasons. One was internal problems in the court, and the other was that he encountered some powerful resistance. After making his choice, he felt that going north was a very risky idea. Fan Xian thought about it. At the time, the Yi family affair had not yet erupted, and the court was basically under the control of the emperor and his mother's subordinates. Logically speaking, there shouldn't have been any internal problems. As for external enemies, he frowned. Was there any power in the world that could stop the powerful kingdom of Qing? The temple. Xiao An seemed to have guessed what Fan Xian was thinking and gave him a reference. Fan Xian shook his head. An illusory object is not enough to resist human ambition, or perhaps the desire for power. To unify the world and unify the 4 seas is too tempting for an emperor. Xiao An smiled and acknowledged his words. The North and South have been at war for years. Even if the South Kingdom of Qi were to be defeated, it would take at least a decade for them to truly stabilize the situation and destroy all the forces of restoration. Besides, don't forget Dongyi. It is the place where the 9th-level masters of the world are gathered. Although this power is not enough to protect the country and open up new territory if it is combined into a stick under the leadership of that idiot Siga Jian, it could really do some crazy things. The triangle is the most stable. The 3 countries stand in a tripod, and it is also the most stable structure. Fan Xian nodded. Even if there is a difference in strength between the 3 powers, whoever wants to break this balance first will most likely suffer a backlash. The kingdom of Qing's court is the same. Xiao An looked at him with a faint smile. The emperor, the courtiers, and the seemingly crazy but actually sinister eldest princess make up the triangle you speak of. Whoever wants to break this balance first will suffer. These days, Fan Xian didn't hide anything. He talked about the affairs of the kingdom of Qing's court. It wasn't a secret, and if this old man didn't die at his hands after returning to Northern Qi, there must be many ways to find out. Fan Xian's temples ached faintly. He didn't know why, but he began to miss Sea Lily's gentle fingers. If everyone is smart enough, let's first maintain the current balance, he said quietly. Impossible. Xiao An looked at him. Because you made the first move, the other side must have reacted. I'm willing to bet that the capital has long since become a pot of porridge. Master Fan, when you sent me back to the north, you missed this excitement. It is a pity. Fan Xian was surprised. He began to listen to Xiao En's cold analysis of the situation in the capital. Chapter 189. Jingdo was far warmer than Beijiang. Early in the morning, flowers bloomed on the branches. Every night, tens of thousands of lights illuminated the spring bridge. It was very lively. 10 li of red candles reflected the river of flowers. It was a good time to enjoy the spring. But during the day, Jingdo was somewhat quiet. It seemed that both commoners and officials found it difficult to resist the sleepiness of spring. They were lazy and did not want to move much, so there were not many people on the streets. At noon, a scholar with a gloomy expression walked in from the east gate of the capital, supporting a woman. The expressions and movements of these two people did not seem like mother and son. They did not go to live in an inn. Instead, they went directly to an unremarkable manor in the west of Jingdo. Only a few people knew that the true owner of this manor was an imperial censor of the imperial censorate. The sleepiness of spring could not be resisted, but it could be awakened. One day in March, just like the day after the spring examinations, a few bolts of spring thunder struck out of nowhere. A patter of spring rain fell, soaking every building in Jingdo and every alley. After the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council returned from Jiangnan to the relevant corrupt officials and salt merchants, the examination hall fraud case was finally concluded. Other than an assistant minister who was sentenced to be exiled 3,000 li, the other 17 officials involved were all sentenced to death. This was the emperor's edict, and the evidence was irrefutable. No faction dared to speak out of turn, and no civil official dared to raise any objections. The Minister of Rights, Guayu, was also sentenced to death. He was the highest-ranking official to receive the death penalty since the founding of Qing Kingdom. When the news came out, the court was shocked. It was said that even the Empress Dowager went to the emperor's palace to plead for mercy. But after some gentle words from the emperor wiped away some of his tears and changed the sentence to hanging in prison, leaving Guayu's corpse intact. The Empress Dowager was sad and did not say anything more. Along with Guayu, there were 16 other officials who went to die. Raindrops slowly fell from the sky and landed on the ground of the usually busiest salt market in Jingdo. However, it still did not chase away the people of Jingdo who had braved the rain to watch the execution. 16 officials wearing white robes knelt on the wooden platform that had been set up earlier. Their clothes were long stained with blood. Presumably, they had suffered a great deal of torture. These officials, who used to be glamorous, now had defeated expressions. Their hair was messy and tangled. They looked wretched. No one knew what the Overwatch Council had done, but some of the stronger criminals forced their lifeless eyes open. They wanted to find their relatives among the crowd watching the execution. Their mouths opened wide, but they couldn't make a sound. Mu Tai, the agent of the 1st Bureau of the Overwatch Council, sat under the canopy, watching the scene in front of them. Mu Tai's face was expressionless, but the rest of the civil officials looked a little uncomfortable. Those criminals who were waiting to die under the execution platform were once their colleagues. They had enjoyed themselves on the pleasure boats and drunk with them at the banquet table. But now they had to watch them die in front of their eyes. The rain fell on the eaves of the restaurant next to the salt market and flowed down along the tiles, forming a small waterfall from the sky. There were many buildings here, so there were a dozen small waterfalls. They hit the stone floor like white dragons, making a pitter-patter sound. A high-ranking official stood up and announced the decree in a loud voice. However, he was interrupted by the pitter-patter of the small waterfalls, so he couldn't hear clearly. The surrounding crowd only saw his mouth move, but they didn't know what he was saying. Finally, the high-ranking official's expression became serious and he shouted, "Execute!" The surrounding people heard this word clearly and immediately became excited. They shouted and squeezed forward, wanting to be closer to the wooden platform and enjoy this rare scene. The executioner on the wooden platform spat and wiped the rain off his face. He put the broadsword behind his back and stepped forward. He extended his left hand and gently pressed the back of the first criminal's neck to confirm the location of the joint. He then roared, and the light of the broadsword flashed. When the broadsword fell, it made a muffled sound like a sharp knife cutting through pork. With a swoosh, fresh blood sprayed out from the headless cavity and splattered far away. The criminal official's head fell dejectedly onto the wooden platform. It was as if it was still afraid of the Qing court's large knife. It rolled with a rumbling sound. Using the flow of the rain, it did not stop. It rolled to the side of the wooden platform and landed. Seeing a dazed, blood-stained head fall to their feet, the previously excited people of Jingdo took a big step back in fright. Where the head rolled, it left a bloody mark. However, when the rainwater washed over it, it quickly faded away without a trace. Only now did the people watching the execution let out a cheer. However, there were not many people cheering, and the cheers were not very orderly. It seemed a bit scattered. On the high platform, Mu Tai, who was sitting in the lowest chair and watching the execution, showed a look of displeasure. Immediately after, the executioner made another cut, and another head fell to the ground. Another beam of blood flew into the sky. Another cry of surprise. Another life was lost. There were a total of 3 executioners. In just a moment, 16 criminal officials were all beheaded, leaving behind a ground covered in blood and corpses. As the beheadings continued, the surrounding crowd gradually became bolder. The cheers grew louder and louder. In the end, when the head of the director of the Board of Rights was tragically separated from his body, the cheers shook the heavens. It scared the rain that filled the sky and made it float away. A few bailiffs from the capital government were busy looking for the head of the criminal official in the crowd. However, after searching for a long time, they could not find it. After a while, a black dog ran out of the crowd with a head in its mouth. Its sharp teeth were biting on the head's ear, and a pair of dog eyes darted around. The light in the dog's eyes made people feel cold for no reason. Woof! The black dog but was hit by the scabbard of the bailiff's knife. In pain, it let go of the head in its mouth. It whined a few times and jumped into the rain. In the following days, a series of actions took place. The Minister of Justice was exposed for taking bribes and bending the law. The Overwatch Council found gold and silver in his third aunt's courtyard, as well as prohibited items. This was reported to the court and transferred to the Supreme Court. He was stripped of his position and demoted to a judge of Ijo. He was demoted from a first-rank miner to a seventh-rank miner. Ijo was far to the south, and there was a lot of miasma and heat. It was likely that the Minister of Justice, Han Jiwei, would never return to the capital. On the surface, Imperial Censor Guozheng did not seem to be affected. However, the court still found an excuse to send him to Jiangnan. Although Jiangnan was a beautiful place, the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had people in Jiangnan. It was just a matter of when they wanted to do something to him. The civil officials in the court did not join together to attack the Overwatch Council because of their relationship with the Prime Minister. They also felt that the Overwatch Council had solid evidence and did not act too harshly. However, all the officials knew that this was revenge. This was the Overwatch Council's naked revenge for the incident in the hall of the Ministry of Justice because of Commissioner Fan Xian, who was far away in the north. Revenge and counter-revenge, control and counter-control, until a tacit balance was reached in the end. This was the unchanging theme of the Qing officialdom over the past few decades. So no one expected that when the Overwatch Council and the Prime Minister's vengeance had stopped at a certain limit, the counterattack from Xinjiang and the Empress would still come so quickly. The young scholar mentioned earlier was He Zhongwei, who could not participate in the spring examinations because of the death of his father. He was a student of scholar Tseng Wenxiang and had always been close to the Guo family. He did not expect to hear the explosive news in his hometown. The minister was waiting for death in prison, his family property confiscated, and his good friend Guo Baoquan was nowhere to be found. What angered He Zhongwei the most was that the crown prince of the Eastern Palace did not lend a helping hand in this matter. The woman who entered the capital with He Zhongwei had an even more bizarre background. She was Wu Bo, An's wife. Wu Bo, An was a strategist placed in the prime minister's manor by the eldest princess. Last year, He had persuaded the second son of the Lin family to join forces with Northern Qi in an attempt to assassinate Fan Xian on Yulon Street. As the prime minister, Lin Ruofu naturally hated Wu Bo, and who had caused the death of his only normal son. Although Wu Bo had died early, the Wu family still had a lot of property in Shandong. The local officials were the prime minister's students, so in accordance with the wishes of the prime minister, they tortured the Wu family. In the short span of half a year, who knew how much silver they had raked in? Wu Bo and his own son had been imprisoned for no reason and tortured to death. Although the woman was not literate, she knew that the prime minister was powerful and that the Wu family could not contend with him. But her heart was grieved by the tragic death of her son. She made up her mind and went to the capital alone, ready to file a complaint against the emperor. While resting outside the city, the poor woman, coincidentally, ran into He Zongwei, who was returning to the capital. He Zongwei was a smart man. After hearing this, he knew that there was a lot he could do. He comforted the woman, saying that he would find a way to seek justice for her. After entering the capital, He Zongwei used his connections with his teacher to temporarily settle Wu Bo in the manner of an old imperial censor. In those days, mysterious people would often come and go from the manor, gently asking Wu Bo about the details of the tragedy in her hometown. He Zongwei watched all of this with some indifference. Only when Lady Wu nervously asked him questions would he put on a smile and comfort her, saying that the righteous officials of the court were working on it and that the prime minister would soon fall from power. The garden of the old imperial censor's manor was a bit run down. Standing behind the fake mountain, a trace of pride flashed across He Zongwei's face. He destroyed the secret letter from Xinyang and thought about the officialdom of the capital after the prime minister's fall. He couldn't help but think of the prime minister's in-laws, Minister Fan, and of the somewhat cold and distant Miss Fan, and his heart warmed. Chapter 190. Within a few days, the imperial censors of the imperial censorate began to collectively submit petitions accusing Prime Minister Wu Bowen of treacherously stealing other people's property and murdering the lives of the common people. The court was shocked, but because Wu Bowen was a Northern Qi spy, public opinion was generally inclined towards the Prime Minister's side. However, on the way to the Supreme Court to give her testimony, Lady Wu encountered an assassination attempt. It was unknown whether Lady Wu was lucky or the Prime Minister was unlucky. At the time, the second prince and Crown Prince Jing were wandering the streets and happened to be saved. In this way, the flavor of the matter began to change. It was rumored that deep in the palace, His Majesty the Emperor had asked the Crown Prince and the second prince how they should handle this matter. After a moment of silence, the Crown Prince said that there was insufficient evidence. Furthermore, the Prime Minister had performed meritorious deeds for the country and should not be easily trusted. Although the second prince had saved Lady Wu on the street, he maintained a taciturn attitude like his brother. After all, the Prime Minister was the head of all the officials. No matter how he was dealt with, it would cause a huge uproar. However, when Imperial Prince Jing heard about this from his son, he flew into a rage. It was a rare occasion for him to enter the palace and have a long talk with his brother. However, no one knew exactly what they talked about. That night, the emperor flipped through the memorials of the past decade. He looked at the money in the Ministry of Revenue and the achievements that the Prime Minister had painstakingly made. He was speechless and could only sigh. Shandong Provincial Governor Peng Tingsheng. He passed the provincial examinations 11 years ago. At that time, I had just ascended to the position of Prime Minister, and I felt that this student was very obedient. Prime Minister Lin Ruofu was in his 40s this year, but his complexion was somewhat haggard. But I didn't expect him to be so obedient. You should know that if I didn't ask Peng Tingsheng to do these things, Wu Bo and would already be dead. If I really wanted to vent my anger on his family, it wouldn't be so simple. Perhaps Lord Peng was secretly trying to figure out the Prime Minister's thoughts, so he did such a foolish thing. Lin Ruofu's trusted aide, Yuan Hongdao, frowned slightly.
Oh.
Lin Ruofu looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. But Peng Tingsheng is not an idiot. If it were not for the Prime Minister's orders, he would not have used his official reputation as a wager. Moreover, who was the one who killed someone on the streets of the capital the day before yesterday? How did the investigation reach the Prime Minister's residence? Yuan Hongdao's expression was somewhat wooden. He gently stroked the long beard on his chin and said, "He Zhongwei is a member of the Eastern Palace, but he's just a small pawn. He shouldn't have the courage to do this. There must be someone behind him supporting him. I just don't know if it's the Empress or the eldest princess." "It's Yunruwei." The Prime Minister smiled. "Most of her power is in the Imperial Censorate. This is her way of taking revenge on me." "What revenge?" "Revenge, Galat." The Prime Minister sighed. "Including Chioner's matters, including my son-in-law's matters, including the matters between me and her." "Actually," Yuan Hongdao hesitated.
"Speak."
Yuan Hongdao smiled slightly. "In truth, it still depends on His Majesty's will. If His Majesty does not believe, the Prime Minister's position will naturally be as stable as Mount Tai. His Majesty will definitely see through such a clumsy method." The Prime Minister smiled. "But the question is whether His Majesty is willing to see it clearly." "Why do you say that, Prime Minister?" "So many officials died a few days ago. As the head of the civil officials, I have to take responsibility." The Prime Minister closed his eyes and analyzed. "Most importantly, His Majesty does not want me to continue as Prime Minister." Yuan Hongdao replied respectfully, "Prime Minister, there is actually still a chance to turn things around." "Minister Fan, please speak." "Fan Manor and the Overwatch Council have a close relationship. If Chun Pingping is willing to stand on your side, then no matter what the Imperial Censorate does, His Majesty will firmly stand by your side." Lin Ruofu shook his head. "His Majesty only wants me to make way." "Make way for who?" "For the Crown Prince, or rather, for the future His Majesty." Lin Ruofu was deep in thought. "Fan Xian's power is too strong. If I were still in the court, he would be in charge of the Overwatch Council with one hand, the palace treasury with the other, and I would be supporting him from behind. With this kind of power, I'm afraid not even a prince can match up to him. A few days ago, I told Fan Xian that the tallest tree in the forest will be destroyed by the wind. His Majesty's meaning is very clear. He wants to train Fan Xian into a good official, to properly assist the prince who will sit on the dragon throne in the future. Since Fan Xian is going to take the throne, I will naturally have to step down." Lin Ruofu smiled. "If I were still here, Fan Xian would be in danger." Yuan Hongdao was slightly surprised, but from the corner of his eye, he saw that there was a faint smile on the Prime Minister's lips, as if he were laughing at something. The sound of Debeo playing in the water could be heard from outside the window. The Prime Minister's expression softened. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out. Looking at his simple-minded eldest son, his eyebrows moved slightly. "Tomorrow, I will have Wanner bring Debeo to Fan Manor." Yuan Hongdao waited for the Prime Minister's next words. "I will go to the palace and ask for my resignation. I believe that His Majesty will see the hardships of these years and allow me to have a more peaceful old age." Yuan Hongdao was about to say something, but the Prime Minister coldly waved his hand to stop him. He turned his head and quietly looked at Yuan Hongdao. After a long period of silence, Lin Ruofu's voice carried a trace of sadness. "You wrote the letter to Prung Tingsheng." The study immediately quieted down. After a long time, Yuan Hongdao replied in a low voice, "Yes." Even the assassination attempt in the capital was carried out by the guards of the Prime Minister's manor.
"Why?"
The Prime Minister frowned, as if he were very distressed. "Ever since I became an official, I have only had you as a friend, and I have always treated you with great respect. Why did you endure for so many years, and then suddenly strike? And once you struck, you did not give me any way out." Yuan Hongdao and the Prime Minister had known each other for half of their lives. They could truly be described as lifelong friends. Unexpectedly, it was this person who had arranged so many things and single-handedly pushed the Prime Minister into such an awkward situation. He knew too many of the Prime Minister's manor secrets, and this time, he had framed Lin Ruofu. Even Lin Ruofu could only back down. He looked at the Prime Minister's aged face and said apologetically, "Everyone's existence has a purpose and purpose. Old friend, I have hidden in your study for so many years, all for today. I promised someone that when he needed you to step down, I would lend him a helping hand." Lin Ruofu looked at this old friend in front of him, and the corners of his lips curled up slightly. "Just how many benefits did Yunrui promise you for you to sell out your friend for glory?" Yuan Hongdao shook his head. "It's not selling out my friend, and it's not for glory. It's just that His Majesty needs you to retire. The eldest princess also needs you, and the court needs you to leave the capital. As for glory," he smiled bitterly, "I originally thought if you didn't realize what I had done, I would accompany you to your hometown, and we would spend our remaining years together." Lin Ruofu was slightly surprised. He increasingly couldn't tell what this advisor, who had followed him for so many years, was thinking. In the capital shrouded in the darkness of night, Yuan Hongdao, accompanied by his page boy, packed his luggage. With a trace of disappointment and frustration, he turned his head to look at the tightly shut door of the Prime Minister's manor, sighed softly, and got into a carriage. In the carriage, an imperial censor looked at him coldly. "Master Yuan, when can you go to the Supreme Court to testify?" Yuan Hongdao didn't even look at the middle-aged man. His right hand gently stroked the long beard on his chin. After a while, he said lightly, "There's no need. The Prime Minister will go to the palace tomorrow to ask for his resignation. His Majesty will stop the investigation of this case." When the imperial censor heard this, he flew into a rage. "The evidence is there. His Majesty will certainly put the traitor in prison. If you don't dare to testify in court, you'll be implicated. You've followed the traitor for so many years. How can you be clean?" Yuan Hongdao looked at him coldly. This advisor, who had always been known for his elegance, now had an incomparably cold and stern gaze. It was like two sharp blades, causing the imperial censor to feel a little afraid. "I only listen to orders from Xinjiang." Yuan Hongdao looked at the pitiful imperial censor in front of him and said coldly, "Since when was it your turn to order me around?" The imperial censor turned pale with fright. Only now did he understand why the Prime Minister's trusted scholar would betray him at the most critical moment. It turned out that he was also one of the eldest princess's people. Early in the morning, a carriage rushed out of the western gate as soon as the city gates opened. Without stopping, it went onto the official road, heading in the direction of Xinjiang. Yuan Hongdao pressed down on the sharp sword hidden in the handle of his umbrella. His brows furrowed. He was calculating in his heart how the somewhat insane eldest princess would arrange for him a chess piece that had been hidden for so many years, once he arrived in Xinjiang. In the depths of his heart, he couldn't help but feel a trace of guilt towards Prime Minister Lin Ruofu. After all, they had been friends for decades. They had spent more time together than they had with their families. After hiding in the Prime Minister's manor for so many years, he had finally fulfilled the promise he had made all those years ago. In the process of the Prime Minister's downfall, Yuan Hongdao had played the most dishonorable but also the most important role. Lin Ruofu had not killed him. This in itself was something that Yuan Hongdao should be grateful for. He had already dismissed his attendant. Other than him, the only other person in the carriage was the coachman in front of him. Yuan Hongdao looked coldly at the coachman as he brandished his whip. He realized that the coachman's wrist was extremely nimble. It was clear that he had extremely high martial arts skills. After a long time, the carriage passed the 18-li relay station and entered a desolate and uninhabited mountain road. At this moment, the carriage slowly came to a stop. The coachman turned his head and looked at Yuan Hongdao with an unusual and extremely sharp gaze. After a moment of silence, the coachman suddenly opened his mouth and said, "The director has ordered me to express my gratitude to you." He paused for a moment, then said in a low voice, "Please allow me to express my personal admiration to you." Yuan Hongdao said with a trace of sadness, "I do not admire myself. Tell me about Xinjiang's plans. I believe that after this matter, the eldest princess should believe me."
He was a spy.
A spy that had been planted by the Prime Minister's side many years ago. Chapter 191. Everything is for the Qing Kingdom. Everything for Qing Kingdom? Yuan Hongdao sat in the carriage, heading toward the eldest Princess fief of Xinyang. In his heart, he felt the absurdity of the words he had kept in the depths of his heart for so many years. Many years ago, when the eldest princess began to like the Prime Minister, Yuan Hongdao, as one of the first secret members of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council, accepted Qin Pingping's arrangements. He had a new identity and a new life. Gradually, he became good friends with Lin Ruofu, who at the time was not very prominent. At that time, it was just a chance encounter between two scholars. Back then, Lin Ruofu had been high-spirited and vigorous, while Yuan Hongdao had been steady and honest. After experiencing all sorts of coincidences arranged by the council, they had finally become so-called close friends. As the years passed, Lin Ruofu, with the support of the eldest princess, had a smooth journey in the officialdom. Yuan Hongdao, on the other hand, was willing to stay by Lin Ruofu's side as an informant. Even when Lin Ruofu hinted countless times that he could make Yuan Hongdao an official, he only smiled faintly and refused. Because of this, Lin Ruofu regarded him as the only true friend in his life. It was just that the Prime Minister didn't expect this friend of his to be carrying another mission from the very beginning. Yuan Hongdao had actually gradually adapted to this kind of life because the council had never given him any missions, and the few people who knew his identity had always kept their distance. During these years, the only thing Yuan Hongdao had helped the Overwatch Council do was help the second young Master Lin of the Tsong mountainside courtyard lie after he had been killed and frame Dongi for the Overwatch Council. Lin Ruofu believed him, because he was the one who said it. Yuan Hongdao had only betrayed Lin Ruofu once in his life, and it was enough for the Prime Minister to dejectedly withdraw from the court. This was the Emperor's will. Through the Overwatch Council, he was told to carry it out. Perhaps the betrayal of his old friend had made the Prime Minister see the world clearly, so the next day, he could not be stopped from entering the palace. He even turned a blind eye to Fan Jian's repeated hints. As for the future of the Lin family, the Prime Minister had placed all his hopes on his son-in-law, Fan Xian. Naturally, he did not want to drag his in-laws into this mess. In the middle of the third month, the Minister of the Board of Rights, Gui Yu, died and the Minister of the Board of Punishments, Han Jiwei, was demoted. The Prime Minister asked for forgiveness and retired. His Majesty tried to persuade him to stay, but to no avail. All of the Imperial Censorate's actions regarding Wu Bo An's case had disappeared, and Lady Wu's whereabouts were unknown. His Majesty had decreed that He Zongwei was talented and virtuous. He was to enter the palace and be rewarded. He was exempted from the examination and appointed as the Imperial Censor. Why? Fan Xian sat in the carriage and gently flicked the piece of paper in his hand. This was a report from the Overwatch Council regarding the developments in the court. As the commissioner, although he was far away on the northern border, he had only received the news from Jingdo a few days later than other places. Of course, his father-in-law was not a good official in the purest sense of the word. He was not called a treacherous prime minister for nothing, but Fan Xian still felt that it was absurd. He was the prime minister of a country, and yet he had been silently defeated in the bureaucratic struggle of the Qing Kingdom. Fan Xian had to think about the future. Although it seemed that his father-in-law, the prime minister, had not been of much help to him in the past year, he knew that the reason the civil officials of the court had always been patient with him, including the spring examination case, was because of his father-in-law. Other than the two ministers who had already fallen, Fan Xian had never encountered a real challenge in the bureaucracy of the Qing Kingdom. Fan Xian's question was directed at Xiao En, who was chained and unable to dance.
Why?
Xiao En analyzed coldly. Because you made a move. The Emperor of the Qing Kingdom took the opportunity to weaken the power of the civil officials. But how could just two ministers satisfy the Emperor's appetite? You are the son-in-law of the Prime Minister, and your reputation has spread far and wide. If the Emperor really wants you to take charge of the Overwatch Council in the future, then for the sake of safety, the Prime Minister must quickly step down. As for how to step down, Xiao En laughed mockingly. If an emperor wants an official to step down, there are countless ways. Besides, your emperor has always been a strange man who likes to use the Overwatch Council. The reason why the emperor of the Qing kingdom was a strange man was because the Overwatch Council was too powerful, and yet the emperor still trusted Qin Pingping. This was an anomaly. Fan Xian shook his head. There is something strange about this case. Even if my father-in-law was pained by the death of my second brother, he had many ways to make Wu Bo and die without descendants. As for the assassination of Lady Wu in the capital, it just so happened that the second prince and Li Hongqing ran into each other. Such a foolish method is far from my father-in-law's ability. There is a traitor at the prime minister's side, Xiao En said lightly. As for whether it is the eldest princess's people or your emperor's people, in truth, it makes no difference. Fan Xian wasn't sure. To be able to force my father-in-law to step down, there must be concrete evidence. My father-in-law is a cautious man. How could he allow a spy from a hostile power to come into contact with such important matters? He had no idea that the one who had betrayed his father-in-law was that Mr. Yuan Hongdao, and he had no idea that the Overwatch Council was behind this. Xiao En laughed with some satisfaction. How much do you, young man, know about what is hidden in the darkness? He had the right to say this. Back then, the civil strife in the kingdom of Qing had been orchestrated by this old man. If not for the sudden deaths of the two princes, perhaps the kingdom of Qing would no longer exist. Fan Xian's eyelids twitched. In his conversations with Xiao En these past few days, he had discovered that although he had been imprisoned for many years and did not know the distribution of power in the kingdom of Qing, Xiao En could clearly see where the problem lay when Fan Xian explained it to him. He had even guessed exactly what kind of punishment the officials involved would receive in the spring examination case. Xiao En had once said that the prime minister would step down because of this. But there had been no warning, and the spring examination case did not involve the prime minister's manor. The eldest princess, who had a broken relationship with the prime minister, was far away in Xinjiang, so Fan Xian did not believe him. Unexpectedly, Xiao En had guessed correctly. Fan Xian couldn't help but be shocked at the old man's vicious insight. Only now did he realize that his reputation was well-deserved. Fan Xian sighed. Looking at the old man, he suddenly said, I'm more and more curious. Why didn't the Overwatch Council kill you immediately after they caught you? Because I have a lot of useful things in my head. Then at least they could have been more ruthless, said Fan Xian. Like cutting off your 5 limbs. What do you mean by 5 limbs? Xiao En was a little curious. Everything has a bottom line. When things exceed the bottom line I can endure, I think at least I still have the ability to kill myself. But you are not willing to pay that price. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows in thought. This was indeed the case. He got up and saluted him, then got out of the carriage. He stood next to the carriage, looking at the fresh reeds floating by the lake in the distance. He vaguely understood the emperor's true meaning. The court needed new blood. As the saying goes, flowing water never rots. The prime minister had been in his position for too long. Fan Xian's sudden rise in the capital made the matter of the prime minister's removal even more urgent. There was no noble in the palace who would allow the prime minister, the head of all officials, to have a son-in-law in charge of the Overwatch Council. If the emperor really wanted to put Fan Xian in an important position in the coming year, then the prime minister had to leave. Otherwise, Fan Xian would be suppressed. But Fan Xian knew that the unfamiliar emperor would not truly suppress him. If Fan Xian was the wave at the back, then the prime minister was the powerless spray at the front. He had to bid farewell to the stage of history and make room for himself. This was a very normal process in officialdom. Seeing that the prime minister had left in a carefree manner, it seemed that he had long since anticipated the end of the story. But Fan Xian thought of Wan who had stayed behind in the capital, and of that silly Debao whom he had somehow gotten along with. He still felt a little worried, and a faint worry crept into his brow. I hope father and Qin Pingping can protect the rest of the Lin family. He frowned as he looked at the yellow reeds. Why did they refuse to turn green? His heart suddenly thumped, and he began to think about the role of the Overwatch Council in this matter. Inexplicably, Fan Xian felt a trace of anger. As the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he did not believe that the council did not know of the Emperor's intentions. And then he thought of the poison in Sea Lily's body, and he suddenly felt a little cold. Chen Pingping was only constantly removing obstacles in Fan Xian's way, even if they were Fan Xian's family. This method of removal was unusually cold, unusually heartless, and did not even consider Fan Xian's feelings. In the afternoon, after many days of travel, the diplomatic mission finally approached the Great Lake at the border between the two countries. The Great Lake had no name. It was simply called the Great Lake because it was exceptionally large. Fan Xian looked at the rolling blue waves in front of him, and as the cool breeze blew across the surface of the lake, he became much more clear-headed. A bright and beautiful smile once again appeared on his face. Although the diplomatic mission's convoy had already arrived at the Great Lake, it would still take several days to circle around the lake and truly enter the borders of northern Qi. Fan Xian knew that if Xiao En was truly going to make a move, it would probably be in the next few days. In the distance, there were water birds flying leisurely close to the surface of the lake, their long beaks gliding through the water. When they encountered a fish, they nimbly closed their beaks and flew to the lakeshore. Then, using their slender claws, they would step on the fish, raise their necks to the sky, and swallow them with a gulp. It looked incredibly relaxed and carefree. Fan Xian's heart suddenly skipped a beat, and he strode toward the carriage that he had not visited in many days. Lifting the curtain and entering, he looked at Sea Lily, who had a slightly stunned expression on her face, and smiled. Chapter 192. Do you want to live on? Sea Lily was startled. She looked at Fan Xian, who she hadn't seen for many days, and didn't know what to think. Hearing this abrupt question, she felt even more baffled. She smiled slightly. Even ants are greedy for life, not to mention a slave. Fan Xian didn't like hearing her call herself a slave, but she insisted on calling herself a slave. She was still a young girl. After all, she wasn't a truly ruthless spy. The carriage moved forward again. With a slight jolt, he was sitting next to Sea Lily. Sea Lily moved to the side imperceptibly, as if to keep some distance from him. Fan Xian frowned. There's poison in your body. I believe you don't know this. Sea Lily's clear eyes stared into Fan Xian's. After a long silence, she faintly said, Is it true? You don't seem very surprised. I got out of prison alive this time. What could I be surprised about? Sea Lily sighed with a hint of self-mockery. It was a very seductive sigh. Sir Fan Jr. is skilled in using poison. Since you say there's poison in my body, it must be true. The Overwatch Council of the Kingdom of Qing always has a way to control me. I guessed this a long time ago. Fan Xian looked at the beautiful face of this woman and didn't speak for a long time. Since entering the capital, when it came to beauty, none of the women he had seen could compare to Sea Lily. This is not a way to control you, Fan Xian explained with a smile. It's a way to deal with the Emperor of Northern Qi. Sea Lily could no longer pretend to be calm. She covered her mouth in shock. After a long moment, she anxiously said, What do you mean? Fan Xian looked at her reaction. For some reason, he felt a faint sense of discomfort. Although he had guessed her reaction, once he realized that the young emperor still held a certain importance in Sea Lily's heart, he smiled slightly and recovered his calm. This poison will pass through your body and infect the Emperor of Northern Qi. Sea Lily stared into his eyes. Suddenly, she bit her lip and said hatefully, Why are you telling me this? Because I know you want to change this matter before you achieve your goal. Fan Xian smiled warmly. So, I hope you can tell me exactly what method Chen Pingping used to control you. Sea Lily fell silent and didn't answer his question. Instead, she smiled like a flower and said, Fine, fine. Since Master Fan has already told me, I will go to Shangjing and find a way to cure the poison. Thank you very much. Fan Xian smiled mockingly. Although this poison is not strong, other than me, probably only the royal physicians in the palace have the means to cure it. Are you going to tell the royal family of Northern Qi that you have this poison in your private parts? If you really do this, no matter how much affection the Northern Qi Emperor has for you, I'm afraid you will never be able to enter the royal palace. See, Lily stubbornly said, So, what if I don't enter the palace? The worst that can happen is that the House of Red Sleeves plan of the Overwatch Council goes bankrupt. What does that have to do with me? Fan Xian finally became angry and yelled, I've said it before, I don't like the word servant. For some reason, the rims of Sea Lily's eyes reddened. She looked at Fan Xian and gritted her teeth. But in your heart, am I not inferior to even a servant? Fan Xian looked at the beautiful face of the red-haired woman, and his brows furrowed even tighter. He wanted to know what she was thinking deep in her heart. After a while, he quietly said, I think Miss C understands the current situation. Your life, at least for now, is not something you can completely control. As for what happens in the future, that is a matter for the future. Besides, I don't think you've ever thought of those ridiculous things. Ridiculous things? See, Lily looked at him with a cold smile. Yes, they are indeed ridiculous. Master and I are only a man and a woman who meet by chance on the road of life. Using each other is more real and reliable than being warm to each other. I am very happy that you understand this, Fan Xian replied calmly. Why are you so curious about the agreement between me and Chen Pingping? See, Lily stealthily turned around and wiped the corner of her eyes with the corner of her clothes. She immediately regained her composure and smiled like a blooming flower. You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. You should know the details of the House of Red Sleeves. Fan Xian laughed at himself. I know the plan of the House of White Sleeves very well. I just don't know how Director Chen convinced you. He paused and said, Since you know you are only a pawn used by Chen Pingping to spread the poison, why don't you tell me the whole story? What good would it do me if I told you? See, Lily forced herself to be calm. Looking at the young, handsome face in front of her, her heart itched with hatred. She didn't know why, but during this short journey, she had gradually become infatuated with the innocent smile that occasionally appeared on his face. But when she thought of his cold and heartless words, hatred rose in her heart. She said coldly, What Chen Pingping can give me, can you give me? Chen Pingping is old. I am still young. After saying this, both Fan Xian and Sea Lily felt that it was inappropriate. This was supposed to be a serious negotiation of benefits, but it seemed to have a hint of flirtation. What Chen Pingping can give me, can you give me? Chen Pingping is old. I am still young. The faint smell of mass flowers permeated the carriage. Fan Xian coughed twice, and Sea Lily's face flushed for a moment before disappearing. The man and the woman had something up their sleeves. Otherwise, they would not have become so embarrassed over such a simple conversation. See, Lily rolled her eyes. She seemed to understand this as well. It seemed that Fan Xian still had feelings for her. She couldn't help but smile proudly and bashfully. Fan Xian coughed again and explained, Actually, I can guess one thing. You must have a big plan, but Chen Pingping is already old. Perhaps in 2 years he will die. If you are willing to cooperate with me, I think the chances of success will be higher. See, Lily was a little angry, but she suppressed her anger. After thinking it over, she said, Master Fan, you still haven't told me what I can get out of it. I will cure you of the poison. Once I take control of the Overwatch Council, I will use the power of the North to help you climb up the ranks in the Northern Qi Palace. See, Lily shook her head and laughed coldly. We are separated by borders. Although the Kingdom of Qing is powerful and the secret agents of the Overwatch Council are powerful, they can't reach into the Northern Qi Palace. And who told you that I want a position in the Northern Qi Palace? Fan Xian was speechless. Suddenly, See Lily's eyes flashed. She waved her hand, as if she were calling a pet. She smiled charmingly. Come closer, sir. This cannot be heard by others. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that this woman wanted to vent her anger at being ignored these past few days. He smiled and moved his ear closer. Before he could hear a sound, he felt a warm breath on his earlobe. His heart warmed, and he smelled the faint fragrance of her body. He was immediately shocked by what happened next. After a long time, the young man and woman separated. Si Lily looked at Fan Xian with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. She said quietly, I took a risk to tell Master Fan about this agreement. Dare I ask, sir, can you help me complete this agreement? Fan Xian's brows furrowed like mountains and rivers. He still hadn't shaken off the shock. He shook his head. I don't believe it. Who is Chun Pingping? Even if he had such thoughts, he wouldn't tell you. Si Lily said mockingly. Even you don't believe it. Of course, he isn't afraid of me telling others. Anyway, no one in the world would believe that old cripple had such thoughts. Fan Xian pondered for a moment and understood the whole story. He smiled. So that's how it is. He looked at Si Lily and suddenly said, in the early years, there was a rumor in the capital that Miss Si was the grandchild of some royal family at the beginning of the country. The people of the capital thought it was just a way for you to raise your social status. Now it seems, it is true. Si Lily slowly closed her eyes. After a long time, she said quietly, my real name is Li Lizi. Fan Xian smiled and looked at her smooth chin. He couldn't help but gently rub his fingers. He sighed. No wonder the Emperor of Northern Qi doesn't care about your identity. No wonder you were willing to be used by Qin Pingping. But I have to advise you. You are a girl. Compared to those sinister old snakes, you are too tender. Be careful. If you can settle down in the palace of Northern Qi, first let go of your plans with Qin Pingping and ignore him. Si Lily looked into his eyes. She was a little surprised and a little warm. She smiled sweetly. Thank you for your concern, sir. But I have already told you the contents of the agreement. When will you cure me? Fan Xian smiled. Starting tomorrow, I need to prepare some materials. Also, after this diplomatic mission, I will think of a way to take over from the council, the safety of your brother, or more accurately, the Crown Prince. Please do not worry. Under my watch, the Crown Prince will not sneak into the kingdom of Qing from Northern Qi again. Si Lily was silent. She stood up in the narrow carriage and, with great difficulty, curtsied to Fan Xian. In the carriage in front of them, Shaoan's white hair was tied up tightly, like steel thorns. The old man sat silently in a chair, his hands in a strange position, like a lotus flower about to bloom. The pinky of his left hand was slightly curled up, pressed against the edge of the toilet bowl. The strong Jinqi in Shaoan's body slowly began to circulate. A faint fishy smell covered up the strange smell in the carriage. A drop of thick, black liquid was forced out of his meridians, which were gradually recovering. It flowed along the tip of his pinky and slowly into the toilet bowl. Chapter 193. After that drop of concentrated venom slid into the toilet bowl, the light in Shaoan's eyes gradually brightened. His hands clasped together and made another gesture, gradually calming the chaotic flow of Jinqi in his body. In the Overwatch Council, he had always been tortured and poisoned. The bald former head of the 7th Bureau understood his physical condition very well, so he had a good sense of propriety in his actions. He had always allowed Shaoan to wander around the edges. After leaving the capital, Fan Xian's methods were even more tyrannical, directly injecting poison into his veins. This caused Shaoan's bodily functions to be greatly damaged. But just like what Fei Jia had said to Fan Xian when he was young, the key to using poison was still in the word go. It did not necessarily mean that the stronger the poison, the better the effect. After all, Fan Xian lacked the experience of dealing with a special case like Shaoan. He didn't seem to realize that after 20 years of torture, Shaoan's body had already contained hundreds of different kinds of poisons. These poisons had formed a certain balance in his body, preventing him from dying and preventing him from finding a way to expel the poison with Jinqi. But this time, what Fan Xian had used was like a mountain-splitting axe, chopping into the intricate knots. Although the knots brought Shaoan great pain when they broke, it also gave this powerful figure, who had immersed himself in the art of poison for decades, a chance to undo them. Shaoan's lips curled up slightly. His dry lips, set off by his snow-like hair, looked very frightening. Suddenly, the cold light in his eyes faded, and his whole body slumped. He immediately seemed much older, but his body still exuded the smell of an old man. The carriages slowly came to a stop and began to look for a suitable place to set up camp by the lake. The black knights in the distance swept past the diplomatic mission like a cold wind, sweeping forward and then returning to their ranks. Wang Qinian took out a key from outside and opened the well-sealed iron gate. He walked in with a respectful expression, helped Xiao and eat some food and water, and carefully helped him tidy up his face with a wet towel. Finally, he asked, "Do you want to comb your hair today?" Xiao and shook his head. A cold light flashed in his eyes, but it weakened. In a slightly hoarse voice, he asked, "When will Master Fan be coming today?" He was asking about Fan Xian's daily injections of poison. Wang Qinian smiled slightly and replied, "We are not far from the border. What Sir Fan Jr. means is that Sir Xiao can be spared from daily suffering." Xiaoan's face did not show the slightest hint of joy. He simply closed his eyes and asked, "I hear that Master Fan will be in charge of the kingdom of Qing's palace treasury next year?" Wang Qinian thought it was Fan Xian who had told him, so he didn't mind. He smiled and said, "Yes, that's the richest place in the world." "Are they richer than the Yi family?" Xiaoan's lips curled into a contemptuous smile. Wang Qinian was startled and immediately thought of this unfamiliar name. He smiled and said, "The Yi clan has long since dispersed."
What?
Xiaoan seemed to have thought of something. There was a look of shock in his eyes, but he quickly hid it. Seeing that he didn't have anything else to say, Wang Qinian secretly let out a sigh of relief. He took out the toilet bowl from under the chair and got off the carriage. Wang Qinian covered his nose and carried the toilet bowl to the camp on the other side of the carriages. When he reached the centermost tent, he put the toilet bowl down and grumbled, "Such an old man, and yet he still poops so much all day long. After being locked up for 20 years, his body can still recover so quickly. I'm beginning to wonder if this old man is even human." Fan Xian smiled and turned around. He walked to Wang Qinian's side and opened the lid of the toilet bowl. He frowned slightly and said, "It stinks. This move really stinks." In the magnificently palace in Xinyang, the white curtains swayed in the gentle spring breeze. In the early spring weather, the Li Palace was unexpectedly cold. The palace was filled with winter plum blossoms, very similar to the Guangxin Palace in the imperial palace of the capital. Behind the white curtains, a gentle and timid woman reclined on a low couch smiled sweetly as she looked at her trusted aide, who was currently placing a chess piece. This trusted aide's surname was Huang Yi. His name was ordinary, but he was a very scheming person. Hearing the eldest princess's words, he calmly smiled and said, "In front of the eldest princess, even the world's top players can only play lousy chess pieces." "Not necessarily." Eldest Princess Li Yunrui's delicate and pretty face floated before her eyes, and she laughed for no reason. "That child is a clever person. Don't think that the reason he is so successful is entirely because Fan Jian is close to my brother the Emperor. I still don't understand. Why does Qin Pingping like my good son-in-law so much?" Huang Yi shook his head and reached out to pat his thigh. "There's no way to explain it. If I insist on an explanation, I can only guess that His Majesty likes Fan Xian. My brother the Emperor likes that girl Qin. It's possible that he loves her because of her. Furthermore, Fan Xian is both a scholar and a martial artist. He has one face for my brother the Emperor." The eldest princess smiled weakly. "It's a pity that he thinks he's clever, but in the end, he still made a lousy move." The rear of the diplomatic mission circled around those small vassal states. On the surface, it seemed much safer, but in reality, the vast grasslands and vast lakes were the best places to escape. According to reports, the Black Knights are there. I also know that. The eldest princess smiled. So, it's up to Xiao and whether or not he can escape. Why would Xiao and want to escape? Huang Yi frowned in thought. According to the agreement between the eldest princess and Shang Shanhu, as long as Xiao can return home and make a comeback, the court, master, and disciple will join forces. There is a 40% chance that they can overthrow the royal family of Northern Qi. Xiaoan is not easy to control, just like Pingping. The eldest princess smiled. If he returns to the north, he will be completely under the control of the royal family of Northern Qi. Perhaps he will be imprisoned for another 20 years, until he dies of old age. He will not be of any help to our plan with Shang Shanhu. I gave up my own reputation and that poor official Yan Bingyan in exchange for Xiaoan's freedom. Only then will Shang Shanhu fulfill his promise. I will not allow anyone to ruin this. What if Shang Shanhu goes back on his word? He is, after all, a great general of Northern Qi. Would Xiaoan be willing to throw his life away for Northern Qi? And if I make a move, even if Shang Shanhu doesn't rebel, the idiots of the Zhan family will force him to. Huang Yi smiled. The eldest princess's plans are flawless. No one can match up to you. Don't flatter me. The eldest princess covered her mouth and smiled shyly. I am far inferior to my brother the emperor. She suddenly sighed. Her gaze pierced through the layers of white gauze, and no one knew where it landed. Her incomparably beautiful face looked a little dazed. Her eyebrows were like a painting, and her expression was like that of a fairy. To the side, Huang Yi couldn't help but stare. The matter of the paper last time had a great impact on the princess's reputation. After a long time, Huang Yi finally broke away from that beautiful image. In a low voice, he said, "It's a pity that we haven't been able to find out. But according to the news from the Yi family of the capital's garrison, the matter of the assassins in Guangxin Palace should have something to do with the Overwatch Council." The eldest princess continued to stare blankly at the sky, as if she hadn't heard what he said. After a while, she opened her soft lips and said, "Don't worry about these small matters. What we need to do now is to completely pull Shang Shanhu onto our boat." After a moment of silence, Huang Yi suddenly revealed a glimmer of anger. "In my eyes, this is not a small matter. The princess plans day and night for the court. Last year's Nilan Street incident, the ignorant people and evil officials only thought that the eldest princess wanted to kill Master Fan and take back the palace treasury. How could they know that the princess wanted to find an opportunity for the emperor to send troops north? The court gained a great deal of territory from this matter, but who would remember that this matter had anything to do with you?" The eldest princess, Li Yunrui's brows gradually showed annoyance. She waved her hand and said, "No need to say more." Huang Yi looked at the eldest princess's beautiful face and said with determination, "Let's talk about the matter of Yan Bingyun." Originally, the princess only planned it in secret. Unexpectedly, it was exposed by those lowly people. Now the people of Qing Kingdom all think that the princess is in cahoots with foreign countries. Do those stupid people not understand that, given the princess's status, even if she was in cahoots with foreign countries, what benefit would there be? People always only see the surface of things. They don't know how much benefit the princess's secret arrangements will bring to the court. The eldest princess looked at him coldly. After a moment, she suddenly said, "When Yuan Hongdao arrives, let me know." Huang Yi wanted to say something, but stopped. After a moment, the eldest princess giggled. In a soft voice, she said, "The world laughs at me for being too crazy. I laugh at the world for not seeing through it. As long as the emperor is well, and the kingdom of Qing is well, I don't care about those things." Huang Yi's heart trembled. He vaguely felt something, but he trembled and didn't dare say anything. Pingping should have his own plans. The eldest princess smiled. "I believe that cute child Fan Xian also has his own plans. Actually, everyone's goals for the outside world are similar. It's just that there are some differences internally. If Xiaoan doesn't escape this time, then when he arrives in Shangjing, have our people contact the diplomatic mission and have Fan Xian cooperate with us." Huang Yi was shocked. How could he join hands with the enemy? As if guessing what he was thinking, the eldest princess was extremely weak. She said with hidden mockery, "There are some things that you shouldn't think about. Are you saying these things today to move me?" A trace of ridicule flashed through her beautiful eyes. "In this life, what I hate most is being moved by common people like you. I wouldn't dare." Huang Yi was sweating profusely. He raised his head to look at the eldest princess. Then should we temporarily stop Yan Xiaoyi's plan regarding Sir Fan Jr.? Why should we stop it? The eldest princess looked at him with a smile. That chill made Huang Yi lower his head. I like Fan Xian very much. This son-in-law of mine has not disappointed me, so I don't want him to be too far away from me. Dead or alive, he should be a very beautiful little boy. The most indescribably beautiful woman in the kingdom of Qing slowly raised her face. Her beautiful features were incomparably resolute. Who said that women couldn't shine on the world stage? Since there had been one before, she could definitely become the second. Chapter 194. In the past, Fan Xian had never truly looked at Sea Lily with his heart. He didn't even care for her beautiful face, because Fan Xian himself had a very something face. Ever since they had left the capital, this long journey had, for some reason, gradually, this woman had left a faint mark in Fan Xian's mind. Perhaps it was because of her pitiful past, or perhaps it was because the methods of the Overwatch Council were too cruel, or perhaps it was because, as the former head of the 7th Bureau had said when he first entered the council's prison, Fan Xian's methods may be cruel, but his heart was still soft. At least it was easy for him to soften. He reminded himself more and more not to have tender feelings for the fairer sex, but all the more he felt that Sea Lily was pitiful. This kind of pitifulness was not faked, but a natural feeling brought about by the fate of her life. It was completely different from that of the eldest princess, who was as beautiful as a mortal. Over the past few days, Fan Xian had taken out the medicine he carried with him and found a few suitable plants in the fields by the lake. Somewhat woodenly, he concocted the antidote. This was his promise to Sea Lily. Since Sea Lily had told him about Chen Pingping's idea, although he didn't know if it was true, he would cure Sea Lily. As for the white and red sleeves, they were not within Fan Xian's scope of consideration. What he considered was simpler and more direct. After a few days of treatment, Sea Lily did not appear to have changed, but she went to the toilet more often. Fan Xian waited quietly to one side, which made the girl feel a little embarrassed. The diplomatic mission's carriages gradually turned east, circling the lake. In another 2 days, they would arrive at Wudu, where the Northern Qi army would come to take over the defense. Actually, the Northern Qi people call this lake the North Sea. Sea Lily stood by the lake, running her fingers over the coarse reeds. Fan Xian looked at her and asked, "When did you go to Northern Qi?" "When I was very young. My parents took me and my brother and ran for our lives. The Overwatch Council hunted us down, and most of my grandfather's trusted aides were dead. No one dared to take us in." Sea Lily smiled bitterly. "Actually, I don't have much of an impression of my grandfather, although I know he was the prince most likely to inherit the throne." Fan Xian calculated the time. At that time, it should have been a few years since the assassination of the Qing prince. He couldn't help but fall silent. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Sea Lily's clothes flutter gently in the lake breeze. He smiled slightly, thinking that his mother had killed this girl's grandfather. He couldn't let her know about it. Sea Lily sighed and combed her hair, which had been messed up by the lake breeze. She frowned and said, "Because we were pursued by the Overwatch Council, my father died under the blades of the palace guards. My mother took my brother and I, and luckily escaped. In such a big world, there was nowhere to go. After much thought, we fled to a foreign country and finally settled down in Northern Qi." Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. His family had been destroyed, his father had died a tragic death, and he had left home. It was indeed a difficult life. Sea Lily looked at the mist rising from the surface of the lake and sighed. Unfortunately, peaceful days cannot last. Somehow, the royal family of Northern Qi found out who we were, and so they brought us to Shangjing. Fan Xian furrowed his brows again and said, "They definitely don't have good intentions." Sea Lily turned her head and looked at him with a smile. "Do you have good intentions? Or do you think the Emperor of Qing and the court of Qing have good intentions towards our family?" Fan Xian was speechless for a moment. He laughed self-mockingly. "After all, it is an enemy country. Before my father died, he said the same thing." See, Lily seemed to have thought of something. She slowly closed her eyes, her long eyelashes gently trembling. Later, my mother also died of illness, leaving me and my brother alone. Since the royal family of Northern Qi wanted to use our past, they naturally wanted to control us. So we grew up in the royal palace of Northern Qi. It was at that time that you met the Emperor of Northern Qi. Fan Xian walked to her side and tightened the cloak around her. Come to think of it, you and the young emperor were childhood sweethearts. See, Lily smiled. His surname was Jean. At the time, he didn't look like an emperor at all. He was about the same age as me, but he was like my brother, fooling around in the palace every day. Then why did you later willingly become a spy for Northern Qi and hide in the capital of Qing? This was something Fan Xian was very interested in. The Emperor of Northern Qi wanted to marry me. See, Lily turned around and looked at Fan Xian with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. And I have a family feud with the current royal family of Qing. So I wanted to return home. This reason is very sufficient. Fan Xian shook his head. This reason is not sufficient. See, Lily smiled. The main thing is that the Empress Dowager did not allow me to marry the Emperor, so she allowed me to return home. She had the spies of Northern Qi cooperate with me to build a stronghold on the Lujing River in the capital. Fan Xian thought of something and stopped himself from speaking. See, Lily guessed what he was thinking. Her eyes flickered, revealing a hint of charm. She explained softly, Si Ling and my companions are all aces of Northern Qi, and some are experts at using knockout drugs. Naturally, those who enter the curtains cannot touch my body. There are others who can take their place. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, and a look of indifference appeared on his handsome face. He smiled. Why bother explaining this to me? Don't you want to hear it? See, Lily was a woman, after all, and had a crystal-clear heart. She had long since seen through Fan Xian's little thoughts, so she did not get angry. On the contrary, she asked him gently. Fan Xian smiled and quietly said, At least that night, you did not knock me out. If I'd known earlier that you were Fei Jie's student, I would have stayed far, far away from you. That way, I wouldn't have to be drugged by your drugs. See, Lily glared at him, her eyes flirtatious and rippling. Fan Xian felt a little uncomfortable being stared at. He chuckled and looked back into the girl's eyes. Then when you woke up that day and realized you had been knocked out, would you have been afraid? Would you have thought about how carelessly you had lost your womanhood and felt that it was not worth it? The wind by the lake did not have much of the warmth of early spring. On the contrary, it was somewhat chilly, and it blew the reeds, which had not the slightest hint of green. The wind blew on Sea Lily's face, and she felt that the heat on her face had subsided. She did not know that there were still 2 patches of red on her face, revealing her shyness. After a while, Sea Lily gently bit her lower lip. After I woke up that day, of course, I felt a hidden bitterness, but I thought. She bravely raised her head and looked at Fan Xian's extremely handsome face. She smiled. I thought that it was my first night with a pretty boy like you, and it was worth it. Fan Xian had not expected Sea Lily to speak so boldly and so bitterly. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. After a while, he mumbled, This, what? Sea Lily seemed to smile, and her eyes softened as she looked at Fan Xian. I have always felt that since you are a descendant of the royal family of the Kingdom of Qing, it is indeed somewhat dangerous for you to hang around on the pleasure boats every day. What if the other party was not me, but a pervert who used knockout drugs? Fan Xian coughed. For some reason, he was now somewhat concerned about Sea Lily's difficult and dangerous situation. Sea Lily's expression was somewhat sluggish. I have never thought of myself as a descendant of the royal family, she said quietly. I am just a pitiful woman who bears a blood feud, but has no idea how to exact revenge.
Please do not misunderstand, Master Fan.
That night, the diplomatic mission's entourage set up camp on high ground by the lake. The carriages were arranged in a semicircle around the perimeter, and the lights of the tents in the middle had long since been extinguished. Sea Lily's residence was next to Fan Xian's. Perhaps the conversation during the day had worn too much out of the minds of this strange young couple, but they did not climb over the wall. There were no rags and no erotic stories in the dark of the night. Everything was very quiet. In the distance, the Black Knights could be faintly seen on the slope, and around the camp there were tiger guards and secret agents of the Overwatch Council patrolling. The white moonlight shone on every corner of the earth. There were no clouds, no wind, and no stars that night. The silvery moonlight was like the gently brushing hands of a fairy, caressing the people in the camp, urging them to quickly sleep in order to prepare for the arduous journey tomorrow. Fan Xian would not allow Xiao En to get out of the carriage, so he still sat in the well-sealed carriage. The moonlight shone on the black carriage, reflecting a strange light. Deep in the night, the entire camp seemed to have fallen into a dark and sweet dream. A black shadow floated to the side of Xiao En's carriage like a gust of wind. He took out a key, dipped it in an oiled cloth, and then inserted it into the keyhole of the carriage door. The key entered the hole without making a sound. It was a sign of the care taken. The carriage door was pushed open, and Xiao En slowly raised his head to stare at the Nightwalker at the door. The iron shackles that should have bound his hands and feet had long since been undone, and were placed smoothly on the floor of the carriage. Xiao En stepped out of the carriage. His long white hair fell over his shoulders, competing with the moonlight in the sky for its silver splendor. He looked around coldly and frowned slightly. He knew that something was very wrong, but there was no time to think about it. The old man glanced at Fan Xian's camp, and like a black shadow, he disappeared into the night by the lake. Fan Xian should have been asleep long ago, but now his eyes were open. He sat on a chair in the tent, and his fingers gently played with a teacup. The teacup contained an extremely light amount of knockout drug. The seeds of hibiscus tea were mixed with the tea's flavor, making it extremely difficult to taste. Sensing the slight change in the atmosphere outside, he began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Chapter 195. When he counted to 30, Fan Xian lifted the curtain and walked out of his residence. He looked coldly at the black carriage. There seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary about it. Even the secret mark Wang Qinian had placed in front of the carriage door had not been moved. His opponent was indeed an expert. At that moment, there was a sudden shuddering sound throughout the camp. Other than the members of the diplomatic mission who had been drugged, the trusted aides of the Qinian unit who had been notified by Fan Xian all stood behind him. Behind him came the sound of heavy breathing and the sound of something digging the ground. It was the sound of 3 black dogs. Their mouths were covered with leather, so they couldn't make any noise. Fan Xian scratched his itchy hair and waved his hand. Open the door and release the dogs. Wang Qinian calmly waved his hand, and his subordinates loosened the ropes. The 3 black dogs, who had been locked up for a month, could no longer control their violent, bestial instincts. Following the faint scent that entered their nostrils, they silently went berserk. Their 4 toes dug into the ground, and they became 3 black shadows that fiercely pounced out of the camp. At that moment, there was a flash of cold light. Countless poisoned weapons flew toward the bodies of the dogs. With a series of clanging sounds, the rain-like hidden weapons met with a gust of wind and fell to the ground far away. Immediately after, the gust of wind rushed toward the assassins who had launched a sneak attack. There were several tearing sounds, and after a few miserable cries, the bodies of 2 assassins were cut into 3 pieces. Their heads flew into the air, and blood sprayed everywhere. A long knife rose from the ground, piercing through the air and cutting into the armpit of the last assassin. With 2 swishing sounds, the assassin's arms were like white lotus roots dipped in syrup. They were separated from his body and fell to the ground, bouncing a few times. The leader of the Tiger Guards, Gauda, sheathed his long knife and held it behind his back. The 6 Tiger Guards behind him sheathed their knives as well. They stood neatly in the middle of the camp in the darkness, looking very handsome. But now was not the time for posturing. Wang Qinian had already leaped to the side of the assassin whose arms had been cut off. His leap seemed ordinary, but in the blink of an eye, he had covered a distance of several dozen feet. The Overwatch Council's reputation as a pair of wings was not in vain. With quick movements, Wang Qinian fiercely stabbed the iron rod in his hand into the assassin's mouth. After a series of stirring, an extremely unpleasant sound rang out. Wang Qinian reached into the assassin's already bloody mouth and pulled out the poisonous tooth. He carefully wrapped it in a cloth, then took out a round wooden ball from his bosom and stuffed it into the assassin's mouth to prevent the assassin from biting off his tongue and committing suicide. The assassin's arms had been chopped off, and blood flowed like a river. He was in so much pain that he wished he was dead. After being stuffed by Wang Qinian, tears, snot, and saliva flowed into his mouth. He looked incomparably miserable and terrifying. The enemy actually managed to sneak into the courtyard. Wang Qinian frowned as he looked at the assassin's face and realized that it was a familiar face. Fortunately, the method of hiding poison is the same as in the yard. He then turned to his subordinate and said, "Heal him.
Do not let him die.
Treat him well and make sure he confesses." The subordinate responded in a low voice, but he asked curiously, "Master Wang, you've already broken all his teeth. Will the poison enter his body?" Wang Qinian was startled. He had been a civil official for so many years that he was indeed a bit rusty. He hurriedly took the wooden ball out of the assassin's mouth and washed it with clean water. He then fed the assassin a few antidote pills that Commissioner Fan had given him. Seeing that he was about to put the wooden ball back into the assassin's mouth, the subordinate finally couldn't help but say, "His teeth are all broken. How can he commit suicide by biting off his tongue?" Wang Qinian was greatly embarrassed. He turned his head and scolded, "I like to stuff wooden balls in his mouth. Can't I?" While the camp was bustling with noise and excitement, Fan Xian had already tied up his sleeves and trousers. He flipped the back of his hat over to hide his face, and under the cover of his black clothes, he disappeared into the night. The 7 tiger guards, with their amazing bladesmanship, followed him in the direction of the 3 tracking dogs. There was no sound along the way, and they didn't startle the moon in the sky. They only caused the reeds to sway gently. The camp was guarded by the people of the Overwatch Council, and the Black Knights had left a squad outside. Fan Xian was at ease. Although the poison he had injected into Xiaoan's body was tyrannical, the most important thing was that even though Xiaoan had used his powerful Zhenqi to expel it from his body, it still left a faint smell in his pores. Xiaoan couldn't smell it himself, but the dogs could. In some ways, humans were indeed inferior to dogs. A dark cloud appeared on the horizon, and the moonlight immediately dimmed. Only the sound of the night wind brushing against the surface of the lake and the swaying of the reeds could be heard. Fan Xian's entire body was wrapped in darkness. Only a pair of bright eyes could be seen. After discovering that Xiaoan had succeeded in expelling the poison, Fan Xian had taken the initiative to plan this operation. After all, no one in the diplomatic mission dared to oppose his idea, and the members of the Overwatch Council, who knew the inside story, followed his lead. But this was also a very risky operation. If Xiaoan really did take the opportunity to escape, Yan Bingyan naturally wouldn't be able to return. A poisonous snake would forever remain in the darkness, waiting to deal a fatal blow to a specific person in the kingdom of Qing. No matter what, Fan Xian couldn't bear such a great loss. Suddenly, a few strange noises came from the reeds in front of him. Fan Xian twitched his nose. Through the special cloth, he could still smell the faint scent of blood. The 3 ferocious black dogs seemed to be dead. The fact that Xiaoan was able to kill the 3 ferocious dogs in the blink of an eye meant that he had recovered a lot of his bodily functions. Fan Xian quietly stood on the slightly damp muddy ground, separated by the heavy curtain of reeds. He narrowed his eyes and looked ahead, calculating the distance between him and Xiaoan. He clenched his right hand and raised it. The 7 tiger guards behind him immediately understood their young master's intentions. They looked at each other, then scattered into the reeds, not daring to get too close to Xiaoan. At this moment, Xiaoan was definitely aware that someone was chasing after him, but this old man clearly hadn't forgotten all of his escape techniques even after 20 years in prison. Relying on the cover of the night, the cover of the reeds, and the blowing of the lake breeze, he silently fled towards the northeastern border. Fan Xian knew that there must be someone there to receive Xiao En. He calmly flew forward, the tyrannical Zhenqi in his body gradually circulating. His feet touched the slightly damp muddy ground, and his whole body shot forward like an arrow, scattering the reeds that came his way. Occasionally, he would stop and carefully examine his surroundings. His fingers lightly slid across the reeds, which were clearly freshly broken, and his eyes fell on the steady footprints he had left in the mud. Xiao En was circling. Fan Xian was circling. In the darkness of the night, the hunter and the prey were one in front and one behind, but no one knew when the roles would be reversed. For Xiao En, he had to break away from the diplomatic mission's control and meet up with the people on his side. For Fan Xian, he had to seize this opportunity that he had single-handedly created. Gradually, Fan Xian's eyes, which were not covered by the black cloth, grew brighter and brighter. The marks that Xiao En had left behind were becoming more and more obvious. It seemed that he was old and weak, and no longer as brave as he had been in the past. Furthermore, the poison he had injected these days had not been for nothing. Passing through the reeds by the lakeside, he came to the edge of a short fir forest. Fan Xian frowned. His extremely sharp eyes, even in the darkness, could still see that the footsteps on the edge of the forest were somewhat disorderly. He didn't dare to be careless. He slowly retreated, making a large circle, and entered the short fir forest from the side. Suddenly, a mournful whistle rang out in the darkness. A black rope sprang up from the shallow grass at the foot of the forest. It wrapped around the ankle of a man. It was a tiger guard who had followed Fan Xian into the forest. The tiger guard's entire body was still in the air, but his body had already bounced up with great strength. With a twist of his right hand, the long knife on his back swung out with a clang, cutting the black rope in half. The tiger guard's entire body fell forward with the force of the black rope. It looked like he was about to land on solid ground. A crossbow bolt flew at him. Startled, he raised his long knife and knocked the bolt away with a clang. His entire body struggled backwards, retreating half a step from where he had expected to land. The tip of his foot relaxed, and only then did he discover that there was a pit in front of him. In the pit, there were a few sharp branches that formed a simple trap. Fan Xian stood close to the tree and released his finger from the trigger. Watching the tiger guard once again disappear into the darkness, he let out a sigh of relief. From within the forest came the cry of 2 owls. It was very unpleasant and ear-piercing. There was a slight movement on one of the branches, and the knife flashes in all directions suddenly broke free from the silence. They transformed into 7 streaks of snow-like beauty, cutting through all the space in that area. Countless chunks of blood splattered in the center of the forest. With a swish, the leader of the tiger guards, Gouda, carried his knife behind his back. He waved a torch and illuminated the dead man's face. He shook his head. Clearly, the dead man was not Xiao En. The torch was extinguished again, and the 7 tiger guards appeared. In a semicircle formation, they searched the depths of the short forest. Fan Xian disappeared into the darkness, moving slowly along the trees. He hadn't expected Xiao En to take the man who had opened the car door with him. This realization made him feel a little strange. But he knew that Xiao En was still in the forest because the poison he had ingested these past few days was still emitting a faint smell. The moon slowly floated out from the clouds, and the forest was bathed in silver light. Fan Xian pressed his palm lightly against a tree, feeling the slight tremors coming from all directions. His heart was filled with the confidence to kill his opponent. Xiao En was in this forest. Chapter 196. Xiao En could not hide far. 20 years in prison had taken a toll on him that was difficult to repair. And these days, he had to fight Fan Xian's powerful poison. With great difficulty, he had reopened his meridians, but he found that after a tense escape, he had turned back to kill the 3 hounds that refused to let him go. He had wasted some of his strength. He clung tightly to the branch, his chest heaving up and down. His breathing was a little rushed, and he couldn't help but laugh at himself. When people get old, they become useless. The moonlight shone into the forest, and he could clearly see the 7 powerful figures with long swords on their backs. They were using a very cautious method to force their way toward his hiding place. Xiao En was actually a little shocked. Since leaving prison, this was the first time he had seen the tiger guards of the diplomatic mission. He didn't know when the kingdom of Qing had acquired such a powerful force outside of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. But he was more worried about the young man called Fan Xian. Xiao En knew long ago that his opponent was determined to kill him, and so he had deliberately revealed an opening. Over the mountain next to the forest was Wudu. Xiao En's most secretive disciple had sent out a reinforcement team, waiting for him on the other side of the national border. A cold light flashed in Xiao En's eyes, and he decided to take a gamble. It had been 4 hours since he had escaped from the diplomatic missions camp, and the pursuit and counter-pursuit had also been silent and austere for 4 hours. In the distance, the eastern horizon was already faintly white, and the milky white fog that was unique to the side of the Great Lake had begun to rise from the short fir forest. The fog gradually filled the forest, and this was Xiao En's chance. He slid down the branch without a sound, and his whole body lay flat on the muddy ground. Like a mudfish, he bravely moved in the opposite direction in which the 7 tiger guards were searching. As he crawled along the muddy ground, Xiao En gradually found that familiar feeling. It was the same feeling he had many years ago when he was a little secret agent of Northern Wei, when he had risked his life. The old man suppressed his heavy breathing to the extreme, and the pure qi in his body supported his somewhat weak energy. Under the cover of the fog, he was about to brush past the 7 powerful tiger guards. Although he was a little disheveled and had somewhat lost the grace of a genius of a generation, as long as he could break through this forest and return to the north, everything seemed to be a piece of cake. Thud, thud, thud. 3 snake-like crossbow bolts shot toward Sean's body like lightning, as if they had eyes of their own. Sean's body seemed to have some sort of sensing ability. Before the crossbow bolt reached his body, he had already shifted a few inches to the left to avoid the misfortune of being impaled. But in this way, his whereabouts had already been exposed. The 7 snow-like and bloodthirsty long sabers turned into a terrifying net that directly covered the sky above him. With a muffled groan, Sean had already disappeared from where he stood. The true battle prowess of a powerhouse of a generation had finally erupted at this moment. The air in the forest crackled, and in the blink of an eye, the old man had already floated to the side of the 7 long swords. His body leaned forward, and his momentum actually dispersed the thick fog at the end of the night. He slapped his palms on the long swords. The 2 tiger guards let out muffled groans as they were sent flying by Xiao En's palms. Their bodies smashed into the trees, snapping 2 small trees in the middle. Gauda let out a wild roar and gripped the hilt of the long swords with both hands. He slashed down at the ghost-like figure with a head full of white hair. This saber whistled through the air, but Sean's face was expressionless. The pair of eyes hidden in his white hair shone with a faint light. His palms came together, and his body disappeared into the fog, dodging Gao Da's unstoppable saber. He struck out with his palms, and the strong wind caused Gauda to dodge for an instant. In an instant, the remaining 4 tiger guards' long swords arrived like snow, enveloping Sean's entire body. Sean let out a shrill howl. His feet pushed off the ground, and rotten mud flew everywhere. His 10 fingers shot out, and countless needle-shaped wooden sticks shot out in all directions. The 4 tiger guards heard the whooshing sound of the wind. They gripped their long swords with both hands to protect their entire bodies. The hilts of their swords were in front of their faces, afraid that these unknown hidden weapons would stab into their eyes. Even so, they still felt a sudden prickling pain on their bodies, and their hands were covered in thin wooden threads. Gauda struck again, and the strong wind from the blade blew away the wooden spikes. He gripped his long sword with both hands and raised his head. He saw that Sean's body had already become a faint shadow, piercing through the thick fog and reaching the top of the trees. With a crash, The newly grown leaves were scattered in all directions by a powerful force. Fan Xian's body, shrouded in black clothing, was like a stone from the heavens. He soared through the air and smashed into Xiao En, who had risen to the highest point. His Jinqi was almost exhausted, and he was reaching out to grab a tree branch. He had been hiding to one side. The 3 crossbow bolts from before had been fired by him. With great difficulty, he had found such a good opportunity. How could he let it go? In the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, he and Xiao En had already collided. He reversed his elbow and raised his wrist, and the slender dagger, glowing with black light, fiercely stabbed towards the old man's throat. But at this moment, Fan Xian suddenly realized that Xiao En's eyes, hidden in his messy white hair, were unexpectedly calm. Xiao En's entire attention was focused on Fan Xian. He had been waiting for this moment. Another sharp cry rang out from the withered lips of this old man who desperately longed for freedom. His 2 hands quickly intersected and cleverly caught Fan Xian's knife-wielding wrist. His other hand was like a venomous snake spitting out its tongue, stabbing toward Fan Xian's exposed eyes outside the black cloth. The 2 of them did not stop and fiercely slammed into the tree. It seemed that Xiao En had even calculated this force. He purposely stopped his elbow and used the recoil to increase the speed at which he was digging towards Fan Xian's eyes. The old man's fingers were thin and withered and looked terrifying. Fan Xian's eyes lit up. In the thick fog, 2 hands of different skin colors twisted together like a towel. A strange feeling flashed through Xiao En's eyes, as if he did not know how the black-clothed Fan Xian had reached out with his hand. This was a prediction of the enemy's attack. This was the good result of Wu Zhu's teachings. No matter how terrifying Xiao En was, he was not as terrifying as Wu Zhu. Fan Xian grunted. His right hand tightly wrapped around Xiao En's wrist, and a violent wave of Jinqi entered his opponent's body. His empty hand swept out, and a beam of light cut through the white fog. It was the edge of a knife. Xiao En straightened his palm, shaking Fan Xian's wrist. He raised his knee towards Fan Xian's lower abdomen and pressed down with his right thumb. A faint black light shone from his fingernails, and it narrowly missed Fan Xian's neck. When Xiao En's thumb moved, Fan Xian twisted his body, relying on the endless Jinqi in his body to force his way out of the way. His body leaned to the side, and he felt a chill on his left shoulder. He knew that the blade hidden in his opponent's fingernails had cut into his flesh. The dagger in his left hand was blocked by Xiao En, and his right hand was competing with Xiao En's internal strength. At first glance, it seemed that he could not exert any strength. But the pain in his shoulder made Fan Xian grunt. A sharp edge extended from the dagger, and suddenly one of Xiao En's fingers was cut off. No matter how strong Xiao En was, he was still old. The pain of a broken finger made his right hand loosen slightly. Fan Xian silently pressed down, and the slender dagger, shining with a black light, ruthlessly pierced into Xiao En's left shoulder. The 2 of them were still in the process of falling. Xiao En was silent, as if the dagger had not pierced his body. But he still opened his mouth, as if in pain. A thin needle shot out from the old man's mouth, heading straight for Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian's left foot ruthlessly stepped on Xiao En's knee, and after the sound of bones breaking, he forced himself up half a foot, allowing the needle to sink into his chest. He felt a dull pain in his chest, and with a twist of his left wrist, a long black dagger with 2 sharp edges sliced towards Xiao En's wrist like a windmill. With a slap, Xiao En withdrew his hand. His pure Jinqi gave him enough power to shake off Fan Xian's right hand. Fan Xian's right hand tilted backwards, seemingly powerless, and brushed past his hair. Then, like a bolt of lightning, it bounced back. The thin needle between his fingers gently pierced into Xiao En's neck. Xiao En's body stiffened, and Fan Xian's chest also felt dull. The 2 of them finally hit the ground, sending up a cloud of fallen leaves and rotten mud, and the stench was unbearable. A long knife slashed horizontally, making the sound of cutting flesh. The thick fog rose again. Gouda, holding the knife with both hands, looked at Fan Xian, whose clothes were mottled with blood, but found that there was no trace of Shao En. Fan Xian and Shao En's silent battle seemed to last a long time, but in reality, it was only the process of falling from the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree. In that short moment, two strong men, old and young, in the dark of night, silently carried out the world's most dangerous contest. The seemingly ordinary movements of the two of them, in reality, condensed the most elite killing techniques of the Northern Wei Kingdom, Fan Xian's experience in killing since he was a child. Although it was not extravagant, it was full of effectiveness. If it were any other strong man fighting against either Shao En or Fan Xian in this thick fog of night, perhaps they would feel a chill. This was a fight between two ninth-level assassins. In this world, this kind of scene was extremely rare. Shao En is finished. Fan Xian coughed twice, and with his extremely thin-gloved hand, he pulled out the thin needle that had almost taken his life from the Overwatch Council's special clothes. Once again, he confirmed that the poison in the small wound on his shoulder was not very strong, and then silently reloaded his crossbow. Chapter 197. Shao En knew he was done for. After landing, he relied on his decades of experience and the decaying leaves to disguise himself. He barely managed to hide his scent and quietly made his way out of the forest. If Fan Xian and the seven masters were able to follow him all the way through the reeds by the lakeside and into the forest, then there must be something on him that they could control. Shao En covered his mouth with his hand, forcibly suppressing the urge to cough. 20 years in prison had damaged his heart and arteries. As he fell from the tree, he could clearly and sadly feel that his brain reacted slower than his body. If it were 20 years ago, he believed he could have easily killed Fan Xian while he was falling. Even if there were 7 sword-wielding masters under the tree, as long as he had the familiar North Sea fog to accompany him, Shao En was still confident that he could easily escape. It was just that everyone would grow old one day. The wound on his shoulder could not be stopped. The strange dagger in Fan Xian's hand had a strange edge, and blood continued to flow. Shao En felt his body grow weak, but his eyes flashed with a hint of a smile, as if he had seen through something. He tore off a piece of his clothing, and with a twist of his hand, pressed down the wound. His kneecap had also been broken into several large pieces. The sharp pain stimulated his mind, allowing this old spy chief to continue making his way through the thick fog. After falling from the tree, Gouda, the leader of the Tiger Guards, had sliced open his abdomen. Although he had dodged quickly, he could not stop the wound from gradually expanding, and his black clothes gradually became bloody. Although Shao En had suffered many and serious injuries, the one that truly made him feel helpless was the thin needle in his neck. He did not dare to pull it out, not knowing what the consequences would be. He only felt the blood vessels in his body gradually congeal, and his speed of advance also slowed. His pale old hand still resolutely pulled out the mushroom from under the tree, chewed it a few times, and swallowed it. This type of sequoia mushroom could replenish the blood and disinfect it. This short fir forest was a place he had been very familiar with decades ago, so he had chosen to escape from here. Unexpectedly, he still could not escape from that young man's methods. The sky gradually brightened, but the thick fog still did not dissipate. The white morning light diffused in the fog, exuding a holy aura. Blood finally dripped from the old man's body. Although the sound of the blood dripping onto the ground was faint, he knew that those young men were following him like ferocious tigers in hiding. They could charge out at any time, but he didn't know why they hadn't made a move yet. But Shao En knew that he was finished. No one knew what kind of power supported this old man, who had suffered 20 years of torture and had suffered a few heavy injuries today, to push his body through the fog-shrouded short fir forest, climb over the mountain, and step on the vast, slightly wet meadow. Finally, he saw the land that belonged to Northern Qi. The town called would have shone brightly in the distant sunlight. Shao En sighed and sat down dejectedly. He used his hand to move his right leg, which had already been shattered at the knee, to the left. He coughed twice. In that town, the only thing that reflected light was the glazed tiles. Although this was the countryside, and they could not afford to use glass, Shaoan had known for many years that there used to be a glazed factory a dozen miles behind the town. After it had fallen into ruin, the townspeople had picked up some fragments and placed them on the roofs of their houses. No matter when or where, people always needed to arrange some light for themselves in a gloomy world. Shaoan was the same. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the glowing shards, thinking that after 20 years, the town did not seem to have changed much. On the plains outside the town, a battle had long since ended. The troops that had come to Shaoan's aid had been completely slaughtered. About 200 black knights stood like a lifeless black wall on one side of the plains. A few more black knights made their way through the pools of blood on the battlefield. When they saw an enemy that was still alive, they struck them with their swords. Muffled sounds rang out incessantly on the battlefield. Those young men lying in pools of blood on the meadow should be who are subordinates, right? Shaoan squinted at the scene and suddenly felt tired.
He coughed again.
He had long since understood Fan Xian's plan. Although that handsome young man still lacked much experience, he had the courage to act. Fan Xian had chased him all the way to Wudu, and naturally he wanted to frame the Northern Qi soldiers who had died horrible deaths in the meadow. A slender dagger was silently handed to him. The chill on the blade made goosebumps rise on the back of the old man's neck. "You're not as strong as I thought." Fan Xian's calm voice came from behind him. Shaoan pursed his dry lips and laughed bitterly. "I'm not as strong as I thought either. Given your experience, it shouldn't have been difficult to determine that this was a trap. Why did you still jump in?" This was the thing that Fan Xian had been most confused about during his night of pursuit. Shaoan did not answer him. He only remained silent. He did not tell the young man that because of Wang Qinyan's unintentional words, he had thought of a little girl and a temple. "Why haven't you made your move?" Shaoan's voice was abnormally cold. He looked at the unusually quiet town in front of him. "You and I are both in this line of work. You should know that the longer something drags on, the easier it is for it to change. I just suddenly felt that I seemed to have made a mistake." Fan Xian tightened his grip on the dagger. His eyes, which were not covered by the black cloth, showed a trace of confusion. "I thought that the eldest princess would send someone to receive you. I didn't expect that it would only be Northern Qi. I don't know any eldest princess." Shaoan seemed to have long since cast aside the matter of life and death. He only took a deep breath of the fresh air of the meadow. It had been many years since he had smelled something so natural. In the Overwatch Council's prison, all he could smell was rust and hay. After so many years, he had grown tired of it. Fan Xian suddenly felt that something was strange. His eyes stared daggers at the back of the old man's head. "Let me remind you again. Since you want to kill me, and have chosen to do so on the border, it would be best if you acted immediately. That way, you can pin the blame on the troops below," Shaoan said coldly. "Otherwise, when the fake Northern Qi receptionists arrive and you want to kill me again, you'll have to consider the life and death of your comrade." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. This plan to kill Shaoan on the border was a risk. More accurately, it was a risk with Yan Bingyun's life. Since Northern Qi's General Shang Shanhu had sent people to help Shaoan escape, then in the chaos of battle, Shaoan's death should be a reason that the young emperor of Northern Qi could accept and had to accept. The key was that the diplomatic mission was backed by the powerful military power of the Qing kingdom. But to Fan Xian's great disappointment, Yan Xiaoyi's army did not appear on the battlefield. If he could not kill the eldest princess, then what was the point of killing Shaoan? Thinking of something, Fan Xian tightened his grip on the dagger. His knuckles were pale. "Why do you all always think I'm still a tiger?" Shaoan did not turn his head, nor did he look down at the tip of the dagger. He smiled and said to himself, "I'm just a skinny tiger without teeth. It's just that I know a few things that others don't, and that's why I've been able to survive until now. In the kingdom of Qing, I'm a prisoner. Now that I've returned to the north, I'll still be a prisoner in the fake Northern Qi. Naturally, I have to fight. At my age, I don't really fear death, but I do fear not having freedom." Perhaps I understand now why Director Chin was willing to send you back, and then wanted me to kill you. Fan Xian didn't seem to care about Xiaowen's warning. He continued to speak in a casual manner. This is a trial. Mr. Xiao once said that I am very talented and very strong. It's just that I've never challenged a truly strong individual. You are the first truly strong individual I've ever challenged. Xiao and shook his head. He still maintained his sitting posture. No, I've long since ceased to be a strong individual. I've only been bluffing along the way. As for Chen Pingping, the old man suddenly laughed with extreme resentment and delight. He actually doesn't know anything. He only knows that he can't kill me, so he can only lock me up. He doesn't know why he can't kill me, and he certainly doesn't know what he should learn from me. He thinks he can scheme against the world, but in reality, he's just a pitiful little fool. The old man was very agitated as he spoke. He coughed, and his wounds had long since reopened. Blood sprayed everywhere, falling onto the fresh grass. Somewhere in the grass, it trembled slightly in the wind. What secret do you have? Fan Xian's face was expressionless, but he quietly changed his direction. What do you know? I've been locked up for 20 years, and I haven't said anything. Even Chen Pingping lost his patience, and brought me out to be your prey in the trial of adulthood. Xiao En laughed mockingly. Do you think I'd tell a yellow-haired kid like you? You're not even afraid of death. Why don't you dare tell me your secret? There are many things in this world that are scarier than death. Fan Xian sighed. He sensed that the 7 long knives behind him had already stealthily approached. He smiled slightly and tilted his head to the right to look at the neatly lined-up black knights in the distance.
Suddenly,
without warning, he stepped on the meadow with the tip of his foot, and his body slid to the left. A poisonous needle left his hand, and with a swish, it pierced into the grass. His body was already in midair, as if he were dancing in the air. The slender dagger in his hand was like a pitch-black poisonous snake, piercing straight ahead. It made a buzzing sound as it broke through the air. He had already condensed all the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. Earlier, the 7 tiger guards had already secretly occupied an advantageous position. Fan Xian's sudden sneak attack, and the 7 long knives cooperated with each other to attack the pile of grass, sending up several puddles of white snow. The cold light was dazzling. This kind of power, this kind of sudden movement, not to mention the ambusher, even the unfathomable eunuch Hong of the Qing Kingdom's royal palace would probably be in a difficult position, and would have to pay the price of blood and flesh. Chapter 198. However, things always exceeded everyone's expectations. At the beginning of this strange and torrential attack, a hand, a soft and fair hand, stretched out from the grass. Like the hand of a cute little girl catching fireflies, the index finger and thumb gently came together, and the poisonous needle that Fan Xian had shot out closed between his fingers. Then, the figure flew out from the underbrush, as if somewhat afraid of Fan Xian's unstoppable stab. She floated backwards, but with ease. Like a gust of wind, she avoided the tearing air that came from the sharp point of the black dagger. 7 long knives arrived, like a whirlwind of snow, everywhere they went. The silhouette flew up gracefully and danced among the 7 long sabers that were like snowflakes. Finally, the tip of his foot stepped on the saber with the greatest momentum, and his figure suddenly retreated 40 feet, quietly standing on the grassland. Gauda grunted and pulled back his knife. Along with the other 6 tiger guards, he stood in front of Fan Xian and Xiao En, afraid that the ace would suddenly attack. It was a woman with a floral scarf on her head and a basket in her elbow. In the basket, there were some fresh mushrooms. To be more accurate, she was a village girl. However, everyone knew that to be able to break through Fan Xian's poison needles, avoid the stab, he had gathered all the power in his body, and to be able to float away while surrounded by 7 snow-like long knives, she was definitely not as simple as a village girl. Out of the corner of his eye, Fan Xian noticed that the eyes of the northern spy leader, Xiao En, who did not even blink in the face of death, actually trembled when he saw the village girl. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Who was this female ace hiding in the underbrush? He walked forward, and the 7 tiger guards opened up a space in the middle. Gouda lowered his head and retreated, both hands tightly gripping the long knife. He stood guard behind Xiao En, ready at any time to launch a thunderous strike and cut off Xiao En's head. "Miss, you are?" Fan Xian looked at the woman and asked gently. His face glowed with a feeling like a spring breeze. The woman raised her head. Her appearance was not very special, and she could not be considered a beauty. However, her eyes were unusually bright, as though they reflected the colors of the meadow and the blue sky in her eyes. They were clear and bright, and incomparably fair. Fan Xian was a little absent-minded. He cupped his hands in salute. "I am an official of the Overwatch Council of the Kingdom of Qing. I am here to escort criminals to the Kingdom of Qi. I do not know why you are here. Please do not be angry if I have offended you earlier." This village girl, this unfathomable village girl, was more powerful than Fan Xian. Fan Xian was a man who looked gentle on the outside, but was shameless and gloomy on the inside. That was why he had a smile on his face and said things that even he did not believe. He knew what the other party was here for, and the other party also knew that he was aware of this fact, but he had to say it in a dignified and incomparably pure manner. The village girl smiled faintly. Her cheeks, which were originally not as beautiful as He Yanli's, seemed incomparably lively because of this smile. The seemingly tacky floral scarf on her head began to emit a sense of familiarity. She lowered her head to look at the thin needle between her fingers. After a moment, she said, "This is the first time I have learned that Master Fan's weapon is actually a thin needle." Since she had already called him by his surname, Fan Xian could not bear to continue acting pretentiously. He could only rub his nose and smile bitterly. "Am I that easy to recognize? Or is my fame so great that even the northern kingdoms know of me?" Naturally, the immortal poet of a generation has been heard of all under heaven. This immortal poet has suddenly become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council of the Kingdom of Qing. Such an absurd yet world-shaking event. Naturally, no one would not know of it. The village girl raised the thin needle in her hand and looked at it carefully. Her eyes narrowed into crescent moons. She looked at the thin needle against the dark blue sky. It looked very much like the flying swords that the fairies of legend stood on. "Ah, so it is an ordinary sewing needle." The village girl seemed to be very surprised by this discovery. There was an eye hole behind the poisonous needle. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. This was something his sister had prepared for him. Of course it was a sewing needle. He suddenly asked with concern, "Lady, are we going to keep chatting like this? Mr. Xiao has lost a lot of blood. I am afraid he does not want to hear it." Xiao En smiled. The village girl smiled. "Didn't you set up a trap to kill him?" Fan Xian smiled warmly.
Wrong.
It was the rebel army of Northern Qi who wanted to break the peace treaty between the two countries. During the campaign, Mr. Xiao En was unfortunately killed by a stray arrow. The village girl giggled. She put her hands on her hips and pointed at Fan Xian's nose. She looked very much like the peasant women in the fields. "Master Fan, not only are you good at poetry, but you can also lie without batting an eyelid. No wonder you are the legendary Tianmai. How could I dare? How could I dare?" Fan Xian's expression did not change. He continued to look at the village girl's face gently. "Lady, you are the legendary Tianmai. I am just a very diligent and lucky person." The village girl's expression changed slightly. She looked at Fan Xian with even more interest. The scene fell into silence. Suddenly, an early bird chirped as it flew to the nearby meadow. It seemed to have smelled danger and the scent of blood, and immediately flew away. She smiled self-mockingly. "My name is Duoduo." Begonia Duoduo?
Yes.
Begonia was the most outstanding figure of the younger generation of Northern Qi. She was the disciple of the Grandmaster Ku He and was rumored to be the most likely Tianmai. In the Overwatch Council, Yan Ruohai had once warned Fan Xian. At the time, Fan Xian had been full of hope that she would not be a woman. He had not expected that she was, indeed, still a woman. Fan Xian's expression was calm, and he seemed to have no reaction. He continued to speak warmly. Lady Begonia, are you here to take Mr. Xiao back home? He knew who the other party was, but he concealed the shock in his heart very well. He smiled and looked back at Shan, who was still staring at the battlefield below the meadow. He said softly, I didn't expect to meet you so soon. This woman named Begonia was clearly one of the most powerful figures in the world, but she had dressed herself like a village girl. She smiled. Call me Duo. It sounds better. At that moment, Xiao En suddenly hissed. Neither of you is a Tianmai. You're just two brats who like to bicker. Fan Xian felt ashamed. He knew that although this old man was no longer as valiant as he had been in the past, he still had a good eye for people. Him and this village girl were putting on a show here, and it was unnecessary. At that moment, Begonia bowed slightly to Xiao En, who was sitting dejectedly on the meadow. On the orders of my teacher, I have come to escort Master Xiao back to the capital, she said respectfully. Fan Xian frowned, and his hands fell naturally to his sides. We have not yet left the border, Begonia. Lady Duo, it is too early to worry. He shook his head and waved his hand. The 6 tiger guards behind him immediately changed their formation, forming a charging stance. With themselves as the arrowhead, they aimed at Begonia. Behind them, Gouda had already gathered strength in his arms, preparing to use a lightning-fast strike to behead the dying Xiao En. A strange smile flashed through Begonia's eyes. Her fingers loosened, and the poisonous needle fell noiselessly into the grass. The coarse cloth she wore trembled slightly in the morning wind. Master Fan, are you prepared to kill someone in front of me? She said quietly. Fan Xian smiled. Who knew how many thoughts had spun through his mind? Looking into her eyes, he knew that she was not here to stop him from killing someone. She was probably here to watch him kill someone. He didn't know what kind of secret Xiao En had. To be able to make Imperial Advisor coup, he changed his principle of not meddling in worldly affairs for many years and send this woman, who clearly had the strength of a superior 9th-level martial artist, as an assassin. In this world, there are times when you need to make a very difficult decision in a very short period of time. Fan Xian had spent a lot of effort to lure Xiao En into a dead end, creating this perfect opportunity to kill him. But in this instant, he not only had to abandon his original plan, he had to do the exact opposite. Without question, this was a very preposterous and nonsensical choice. So most people would find it difficult to overcome this obstacle in their hearts. But Fan Xian was a person who was willing to give up. Since he had not succeeded in trapping Yan Xiaoyi in this plan, then killing Xiao En was no longer a very important matter. Furthermore, he was very interested in the secret in Xiao En's heart. So he smiled strangely, already pouncing towards Begonia, who wore a flowery headscarf on her head and carried a basket between her elbows. At the same time, he gave the order for the 7 tiger guards to cover Xiao En's retreat to the Black Knights. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. A total of 7 wind-breaking sounds rang out in a very orderly manner. Right above the meadow, even the light morning breeze seemed to have been cut into countless pieces by the slender black poison dagger. The pieces of Jinchi were like countless broken blades, flying around the begonia headscarf. Fan Xian was very satisfied with his 7 consecutive strikes. Although he had chased her through the night, his body was already somewhat tired. But when faced with the most outstanding figure of the younger generation in the world, especially the character he had naturally disliked in the novels he had read in his previous life, Fan Xian finally stimulated all the potential in his body and struck out with a dazzling number of strikes. Like 7 black lotuses, they bloomed one by one at the side of this woman called Hai Tang's hair. Then, they powerlessly and faintly faded away. Begonia's face was full of smiles. She held a simple dagger in her hand. There were still bits of grass by the side of the dagger, and the juicy bits of grass formed a few miraculous dots on the surface of the dagger. In that moment, each of Fan Xian's extremely sinister and extremely fast stabs had been softly countered by the dagger in the woman's hand. The tip of the dagger trembled slightly, appearing particularly weak and powerless in the wind. But it was like countless gusts of cool wind, binding Fan Xian's slender dagger. In the end, the tyrannical Jinqi that Fan Xian had imbued into the dagger became as light as a cloud in the wind. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.